The air carries the sour tang of damp stone and the faint mineral breath of the muddy river winding through the ruins. Wood smoke curls from a dozen early hearths, weaving through the narrow, shadowed alleys of an exhausted empire. Welcome to Unwritten Axiom. I am glad you are here. If stepping into these forgotten worlds helps you rest, consider subscribing for more. You open your eyes to a pale, grayish light fighting its way through the single wooden shutter. The straw-stuffed pallet beneath you rustles dryly as you shift your weight against the morning chill. This room on the second floor of a crumbling insula holds the dampness of an autumn that never quite dries out. You share this small space with others, their breathing forming a hushed rhythm in the gloom. Privacy is a concept that belongs to a different age, a luxury this cramped medieval iteration of Rome cannot afford. You pull your undyed wool tunic over your head, the fabric rough and familiar against your skin. The leather belt wraps twice around your waist, securing the simple garment for another day of labor. Down below, the street begins its daily argument with the silence. A rooster calls out from a neighboring rooftop, its sharp cry echoing off the ancient brickwork. The heavy wooden door of your building swings open on iron hinges, releasing the trapped odors of the night into the narrow alleyway. The sky is merely a ribbon of bruised blue suspended between the overhanging upper floors of the houses. Footsteps slosh through the center drainage channel, carrying the early risers toward the markets and the workshops. You step out into the damp morning air, feeling the uneven cobblestones through the thin soles of your turn shoes. The city breathes around you, smelling of wet earth, wood ash, and the unavoidable reality of 30,000 people packed into the bend of the Tiber. You navigate the tight passage with the instinct of someone born to these shadows. The walls leaning inward are a chaotic mosaic of ancient travertine blocks, patching up crude medieval masonry. You press yourself against the cold stone to let a donkey pass, its flanks loaded high with bundles of kindling for the baker's ovens. The beast snorts, its breath pluming white in the chill, while the driver mutters a perfunctory greeting. You nod in return, continuing toward the small piazza where the neighborhood draws its water. A skinny, one-eared cat watches your progress from a crumbling window ledge, its yellow eyes wholly indifferent to your existence. The morning routine demands water first, a necessity that dictates the rhythm of every household in the shrunken capital. You arrive at the well, a modest stone ring sitting in the center of the irregular square. The great aqueducts of the ancients are shattered bones marching across the Campagna, leaving this neighborhood dependent on whatever the shallow water table provides. You lower the wooden bucket on its frayed rope, listening to the hollow splash echoing from the dark shaft. The rope bites into your calloused palms as you haul the heavy vessel back up hand over hand. You pour the water into your clay jug, noting the faint mineral cloudiness that marks it as Roman groundwater. Your stomach tightens with a familiar, low-level hunger, reminding you that the day's labor cannot begin on an empty belly. You hoist the jug onto your hip and turn back toward the insula. Breakfast waits in the smoky ground floor room of your building. The hearth fire has been coaxed from the banked embers into a small, steady flame, licking at the sides of an iron pot. Dense, dark bread sits on a scarred wooden board, accompanied by a small dish of boiled fava beans. The crust is hard enough to challenge your teeth, requiring a deliberate effort to tear off a piece. A cup of watered wine stands ready to wash down the coarse meal, its slight sourness cutting through the dry texture of the grain. The other members of the household eat in practical silence, focusing singularly on the rare comfort of food. This Mediterranean peasant diet is stripped down to bare survival, a far cry from the honey dormice of the forgotten emperors. You finish the last of your beans, wiping your fingers on the rough linen of your tunic. The distant booming resonance of a large bronze bell rolls over the rooftops, signaling the hour of prime. Within moments, another bell answers from a different parish, then another, until the sky is filled with a ragged, overlapping chorus of tolling iron and bronze. You step back out into the street, the sound washing over you like a physical wave. There are 400 churches crammed into this small inhabited bend of the river, each one demanding attention. You trace your path toward the leather workshop, letting the chaotic symphony guide your pace. The spiritual machinery of the papal city is awake, keeping time for a population that owns no clocks. You look up as the street widens slightly, revealing the jagged, aggressive skyline of the medieval settlement. Towers bristle from every neighborhood, tall, windowless needles of stone erected by the warring noble clans. The Frangipani have fortified the ruins near the old amphitheater, turning a monument of ancient slaughter into a modern stronghold. You recognize the colors of a minor baron hanging limply from a timber hoarding high above the street. Two armed retainers lounge near the heavy wooden door at the base, their hands resting casually near the hilts of their blades. You keep your eyes forward, knowing better than to invite the attention of men paid to look for trouble. The politics of this place are physical, measured in the height of walls and the sharpness of steel. Ahead, the portico of a ruined temple provides shelter for a busy blacksmith. The massive marble columns, still fluted and majestic, are blackened by the soot of the forge fire. The smith's hammer rings out in sharp staccato bursts, striking glowing iron against an anvil resting on a carved altar stone. Sparks shower across the worn pavement, illuminating the determined face of the craftsman as he shapes a crude horseshoe. He pays no mind to the pagan gods whose sanctuary he has colonized for his daily bread. The past is merely a quarry here, a convenient source of shelter and raw material. Ruins are not revered, they are repurposed, dismantled, or simply lived inside. You reach your own workshop, a cramped space built into the arched substructure of what might once have been a bathhouse. The air inside smells sharply of tanning agents, oiled leather, and the sour sweat of hard labor. You take your seat on the worn wooden bench, picking up the heavy iron awl in a thick strap of hide. Your fingers know the motions without conscious thought, finding the established holes and pulling the waxed thread taut. The work is physically demanding, requiring a rhythmic cycle of tension and release that slowly warms your muscles. A young apprentice sweeps the dirt floor nearby, gathering scraps and dust into a small pile. You focus on the seam, letting the familiar actions ground you in the reality of the morning. You pause your stitching for a moment to stretch a localized ache in your lower back. The doorway frames a slice of the busy thoroughfare, presenting a constant, moving tableau of urban life. A vendor pushes a wooden cart loaded with wilted cabbages, shouting his prices in a guttural dialect that echoes off the stone walls. Two priests in dark robes hurry past, their heads bent together in urgent conversation, perhaps discussing some matter pending before the papal courts. You watch a stray dog sniff at a discarded bone in the gutter before trotting away in search of better prospects. The city is a living organism, chaotic and filthy, yet functioning through a complex web of unwritten rules. You pick up the awl again and return to the leather. By mid-morning, the pale sunlight finally penetrates the deepest alleys, casting sharp shadows across the workbenches. The air grows warmer, carrying the distinct, heavy scent of the livestock that grazes among the abandoned farms. The constant lowing of cattle drifts over from the Campo Vaccino, mixing with the metallic clang of the blacksmith and the calls of the market hawkers. Dust dances in the shafts of light, tiny motes swirling in the draft created by passing bodies. The leather yields to the knife, parting smoothly under the practiced pressure of the blade. Pieces are stacked, ready for assembly, representing hours of concentrated effort. The day demands constant motion, rewarding stillness only with empty pockets. You brush a lock of hair from your forehead, feeling the grit and oil that have already accumulated there. The river Tiber lies just a few streets over, its presence announced by a subtle shift in the dampness of the air. You need to deliver a finished belt to a merchant near the bridges, offering a brief respite from the workbench. You gather the completed piece, wrapping it carefully in a scrap of clean linen to protect it from the street grime. Stepping out of the workshop, you join the flow of traffic heading toward the commercial heart of the settlement. The journey is an exercise in evasion, dodging laden mules, arguing neighbors, and the deep puddles of questionable origin. You secure the package under your arm, guarding it against the opportunistic fingers of the crowd. You hear the loud, splashing churn of the floating mills long before you reach the riverbank. Dozens of flat-bottomed boats are anchored in the current, their massive wooden wheels turning steadily against the flow of the muddy water. The grinding of the heavy millstones provides a constant, rumbling bass note to the neighborhood's clamor. You walk along the precarious embankment, stepping over discarded nets and fragments of broken pottery. The water is a thick, opaque brown, carrying branches and refuse downstream toward the sea. Women kneel on the far shore, beating laundry against the stones, their voices carrying faintly across the channel. You watch the relentless movement of the wheels, a vital mechanism keeping the city fed despite the broken aqueducts. Near the entrance to the Pons Elise, the merchant's stall sits crowded against the ancient bridge leading to the papal fortress. Travelers bottleneck at the crossing, creating a dense mass of humanity pushing toward the opposite bank. Beggars line the approach, extending hands and calling out for alms in the names of 100 different saints. A squad of armed guards stands near the arches, collecting tolls and monitoring the faces of those passing through the choke point. The air here smells of roasting fish from the nearby cookshops and the damp metallic tang of the river. Coins change hands rapidly, silver flashing in the sunlight as negotiations conclude. The pulse of commerce beats strongest where the movement of people is restricted. You find the merchant arguing loudly with a cloth dyer, their hands waving in expansive theatrical gestures. You wait patiently, knowing that interrupting a negotiation is a breach of market etiquette. The dyer finally stalks away in feigned disgust, leaving the merchant to turn his attention to you with a broad, sudden smile. You unwrap the leather belt, presenting it for inspection on the rough timber counter. He runs his fingers over the stitching, pulling the material to test its strength. A brief haggle ensues over the final price, an expected dance that satisfies both parties' honor. You accept the small silver coins, their weight reassuring in your palm, and turn to make your way back through the crush of bodies. You spot a small group of pilgrims huddled near the steps of a parish church, looking exhausted and bewildered. Their heavy wool cloaks are stained with the mud of a dozen different regions, and their faces carry the hollowed-out look of the bone-weary. They hold wooden staffs and clutch small leather satchels, staring up at the mismatched columns of the church facade. You give them a wide berth, wary of the fevers that foreigners often bring with them from the marshes. The city preys on these travelers, but it also depends on their devotion for its survival. You see a local guide approaching them, his smile unnervingly bright, offering to show them the true relics of a martyred saint. You shake your head slightly and keep walking, returning to the safe familiarity of your own labors. Hunger returns as the sun climbs to its highest point, bringing a mild warmth to the damp streets. The smell of rendered fat and roasting onions drifts from a nearby tavern, mingling with the ever-present odor of ancient dust. Shopkeepers begin to pull their awnings lower, seeking shade against the glare bouncing off the lighter stone facades. A momentary lull settles over the market square, a brief exhaling of breath before the afternoon rush begins. Even the blacksmith's hammer seems to strike with a slightly more measured rhythm. The day pivots on this hour, balancing the labors of the morning against the tasks still waiting in the shadows. You slip back into the cool dimness of the workshop, grateful for the respite from the crowded alleys. The coins in your pouch represent security for another few days, a small victory in the endless war against want. You sit heavily on the bench, taking a moment to flex your aching fingers before reaching for the next piece of unprocessed hide. The leather demands attention, requiring you to scrape away the remaining imperfections with a curved blade. The rhythmic sound of the metal against the tough skin fills the small room, a hypnotic scraping that anchors your thoughts. You settle into the work, letting the physical exertion clear your mind of the market's noise. The afternoon stretches out ahead, defined strictly by the tasks laid out on the wooden board before you. You notice the apprentice watching your technique, his young face drawn in a mask of intense concentration. You slow your movements deliberately, allowing him to observe the precise angle of the blade against the material. He nods, understanding the silent lesson, and returns to his own pile of scraps with renewed determination. The passing of knowledge happens without words, a physical inheritance handed down to observation and imitation. You push the blade forward again, feeling the satisfaction of a clean, smooth cut. The shadows in the workshop begin to lengthen slightly, marking the slow, inevitable turning of the earth. The city carries on outside, a chaotic symphony of survival, while you remain anchored to the simple, necessary rhythm of the craft. You wipe a bead of sweat from your brow using the rough linen sleeve of your tunic. The midday heat presses down upon the cramped workshop, baking the thick stone walls and amplifying the pungent odor of the tanning vats. Stray dogs pant in the sliver of shade cast by a jutting timber balcony across the alleyway. The awl slips slightly in your damp grip, forcing you to adjust your hold on the wooden handle. This particular harness piece requires perfect precision to satisfy the demands of the merchant who commissioned it. Your muscles burn with the repetitive strain, a dull ache radiating from your shoulders down through your forearms. Labor in this era is an unending physical dialogue between flesh and material. Dust motes dance frantically in the single shaft of sunlight penetrating the arched doorway. A heavy wagon clatters past over the uneven cobblestones outside, vibrating the ancient foundation blocks beneath your turn shoes. The driver curses loudly in a coarse Roman dialect, his whip cracking above the heads of two straining oxen. Their massive hooves strike the pavement with percussive force, sending a tremor through the stacked leather hides near the entrance. Sounds of commerce bleed into the enclosed space, creating a chaotic symphony of shouting hawkers and braying livestock. The city never truly stops during these peak daylight hours. Everything surges forward with a frantic, desperate energy geared toward survival. You set the finished harness aside on a wooden rack to let the oil soak into the grain. The apprentice brings a clay cup of water, offering it with a brief, respectful nod before returning to his sweeping. The liquid is lukewarm and tastes heavily of the minerals leaching from the neighborhood well, but it soothes your parched throat. You stretch your legs, feeling the joints pop in protest after hours confined to the low bench. A delivery must be made to a client residing near the base of the Capitoline Hill. You gather the heavy bundle of finished straps, wrapping them in a protective canvas cloth. The journey across the crowded settlement demands your immediate attention. You step out into the blinding glare of the early afternoon, squinting against the harsh light reflecting off the travertine ruins. The street vendor selling cabbages has abandoned his post, likely seeking refuge in a nearby tavern until the temperature drops. Heat wafts up from the baked earth, carrying the distinct aroma of crushed vegetation and horse manure. Two barefoot children dart out from a narrow side alley, nearly colliding with your shins before vanishing into the crowd. You shift the bundle to your opposite shoulder, balancing the weight to navigate the uneven terrain. The path toward the ancient hill winds through some of the most densely populated blocks in the district. Navigation requires constant vigilance and a sharp eye for opportunistic pickpockets. High above the sprawling mess of timber and brick, the colossal remains of the tabularium dominate the skyline. The medieval Senate has claimed this ancient administrative center, building their fortress-like palace directly atop the massive Republican masonry. Banners flutter weakly from the crenellated towers, displaying the colors of whichever noble faction currently holds the political advantage. Guards in boiled leather armor stand at the lower approaches, their spears resting casually against the sun-warmed stone. They watch the flow of pedestrians with bored indifference, intervening only when violence threatens to disrupt the immediate peace. Political power in this municipality is a fragile, contested illusion maintained by force. The citizens understand this reality and adjust their behavior accordingly. You pause at the edge of a bustling intersection to let a procession of minor clerics cross the thoroughfare. They chant a Latin psalm in ragged unison, their voices competing with the ringing hammers of a nearby cooper's yard. A boy carrying a swinging brass censer trails behind them, leaving a trail of frankincense that temporarily masks the stench of the open gutters. You bow your head slightly out of customary respect, waiting for the trailing acolytes to clear the path. The church infiltrates every public space, transforming mundane crossings into temporary sanctuaries. You resume your march once the final dark-robed figure disappears around a curved wall. The delivery destination lies just beyond the next cluster of fortified manors. You approach a heavy oak door set deep into a recycled marble archway, dropping the heavy iron knocker twice. A servant answers, his tunic dyed a respectable shade of blue that marks him as a retainer of a wealthy merchant. He inspects the bundle with a critical eye, grunting in conditional approval before handing over a small leather pouch of coins. You count the silver denarii quickly, ensuring the agreed-upon sum is present before tying the pouch to your belt. The transaction concludes without further pleasantries, the heavy door slamming shut to block out the street noise. Your primary task for the afternoon is finished, leaving you free to return to the workshop or gather supplies. The air begins to lose its sharpest heat, signaling the transition toward late afternoon. Footsteps echo strangely in the narrow corridor connecting the merchant quarter to the older residential zones. The buildings lean perilously inward here, their upper floors supported by rotting timber brackets that block out the sky. A woman empties a wooden bucket from a third-story window, the murky water splashing dangerously close to a passing peddler. He shouts an imaginative curse upward, shaking his fist at the closed shutter before trudging onward. Dampness clings to the lower stones of these structures, cultivating patches of slick green moss that thrive in the perpetual gloom. This urban canyon traps the smells of cooking fat, unwashed bodies, and wet ash. Disease breeds easily in these sunless pockets, feeding on the poor sanitation and stagnant air. You alter your route to pass by a basilica currently undergoing a massive decorative renovation. The sound of rhythmic chipping draws you toward the open portico, where a crew of specialized artisans labors over blocks of salvaged stone. These are the Cosmati workers, masters of geometric mosaic, transforming pagan ruins into Christian splendor. You watch a craftsman carefully saw a thin slice of purple porphyry, his blade lubricated with water and abrasive sand. The friction produces a high-pitched, grinding squeal that sets your teeth on edge. He measures the piece against a wooden template, his focus fixed and unwavering. Centuries of inherited skill guide his stained hands. You notice the sheer volume of raw material piled near the entrance, a graveyard of classical architecture waiting for resurrection. Fluted columns of green marble lie stacked beside broken pediments and shattered statuary. A nearby lime kiln radiates intense heat, reducing intricately carved capitals into simple mortar for the bricklayers. The sharp, caustic smell of quicklime burns your nostrils, forcing you to step back from the glowing pit. The builders dismantled the ancient metropolis to construct the medieval one, treating history as a convenient quarry. You admire the partially finished floor inside the nave, a dizzying pattern of interlocking circles and triangles. The visual impact is staggering, reflecting the wealth and ambition of the papal court. Shadows stretch out along the eastern walls as the sun dips lower behind the distant Vatican Hill. The quality of the light shifts from a glaring white to a rich, honeyed amber, taking the harsh edges off the ruined monuments. Work continues at a slightly relaxed pace across the city, the frantic urgency of midday giving way to the steady endurance of the late afternoon. A flock of pigeons erupts from a bell tower, their wings clapping loudly against the still air. They circle twice before settling onto the tiled roof of a nearby bakery. The scent of yeast and hot ovens drifts through the streets, an irresistible summons to hungry laborers. The evening meal requires fresh provisions. You join the small crowd gathering outside the baker's stall, waiting for the latest batch to emerge from the clay dome. The baker wields a long wooden paddle with practiced ease, sliding it deep into the roaring hearth. He pulls out round, dark loaves of rye and spelt, tossing them onto a cooling rack where they steam in the cool air. The crusts are thick and blistered, cracking audibly as the bread rapidly contracts. You exchange a copper coin for a heavy loaf, juggling it between your palms to avoid burning your skin. The warmth seeping through the coarse flour provides a deep, simple comfort. Food in this era is never taken for granted, each meal representing a victory over the precarious supply chains. You carry the bread tucked securely under your arm, the heat radiating through the fabric of your tunic. The journey home takes you past the towering fortress of the Orsini clan, its sheer stone walls presenting a hostile face to the street. Armed men patrol the upper hoardings, their silhouettes dark against the fading sky. A cart loaded with barrels rumbles through the heavy iron gates, the iron-shod wheels sparking against the pavement. You keep your distance, walking quickly to avoid any unwanted scrutiny from the guards. The ongoing feuds between these noble families can erupt into violence without warning, catching innocent bystanders in the crossfire. Survival often depends on knowing which streets to avoid. Somewhere in the distance, a single bronze bell tolls a deep, resonant note. It is the hour of Vespers, the church's official declaration that the working day is drawing to a close. A dozen other churches join the chorus within seconds, filling the autumn air with a rolling, majestic clamor. Blacksmiths lay down their hammers, weavers cover their looms, and merchants begin to shutter their stalls for the night. The transition is abrupt, governed entirely by the liturgical calendar rather than any individual choice. The city exhales collectively, the tension of labor dissolving into the quiet transition of evening. The most dangerous part of the day, the unlit night, approaches rapidly. You find your street hushed compared to the bustling thoroughfares, the shadows pooling heavily in the corners where the buildings meet. A lone dog scratches at a closed door, whimpering faintly before curling into a tight ball on the cobblestones. The smell of wood smoke intensifies as households across the district bank their fires for the evening meal. You spot the one-eared cat from this morning, now perched precariously on a wooden rain barrel, watching a mouse hole with predatory patience. The daily struggle for existence spans every species trapped within these ancient walls. You push open the heavy door to your building, the iron hinges groaning in familiar protest. The interior welcomes you with the accumulated smells of damp wool and roasted root vegetables. You place the warm loaf on the scarred wooden table, taking a moment to flex your aching shoulders. The other members of the household are already gathering, their faces illuminated by the weak, flickering light of a single tallow candle. The wife stirs a thick pottage over the hearth, the bubbling liquid offering a savory aroma that makes your stomach rumble. Children sit cross-legged on the packed earth floor, playing a muted game with smooth pebbles salvaged from the riverbank. The harsh demands of the daylight hours recede, replaced by the intimate, enclosed reality of the family unit. You wash your hands in a small clay basin, the water shockingly cold against your calloused skin. The ritual of the evening meal grounds you, marking the boundary between the public struggle and private survival. Outside, the sky deepens into a bruised, velvety purple, the first stars pricking through the gathering gloom. The curfew bell will sound soon, locking the city down, turning the streets over to the thieves and the night watch. A cold draft snakes under the ill-fitting door, causing the candle flame to dance wildly and cast long, distorted shadows against the plastered walls. The structural decay of the insula is a constant battle against the elements, one fought with rags stuffed into cracks and prayers for a mild winter. The Roman autumn holds a deceptive chill, capable of sinking deep into the bones of those lacking sufficient wool. Heat becomes a precious commodity, hoarded around the small cooking fire. You tear a hunk of bread from the loaf, dipping the hard crust into the wooden bowl of pottage passed to you. The stew is thick with turnips and softened legumes, flavored with a tiny scrap of salted pork. The simple, heavy food hits your stomach with a reassuring solidity, replacing the day's exhaustion with a grounding weight. Conversation around the table is sparse, limited to brief murmurs about the price of grain and the rumors of a new papal tax. Everyone chews steadily, stretching the meal to savor the temporary feeling of fullness. The flickering firelight paints the faces of your companions in stark relief, highlighting the deep lines etched by years of unrelenting hardship. This communal sharing of calories is the bedrock of medieval existence. You lean back against the cool stone wall, letting the empty bowl rest in your lap. The heavy wooden shutters are pulled tight and barred, shutting out the creeping darkness and the unknown threats that roam the alleys. The distant hoot of an owl carries over from the ruins of the Palatine Hill, a lonely sound that emphasizes the vast, empty spaces surrounding the inhabited zone. A stillness settles over the room, broken only by the crackle of the hearth and the rhythmic scrape of a wooden spoon against the pot. You rub the dried clay from your knuckles, examining the fresh blisters forming along your palm. The labor never truly ends. It merely waits patiently for the dawn. Firelight catches the edge of a polished metal cup, reflecting a warm copper glow across the rough timber table. A neighbor knocks sharply on the door, seeking to borrow a pinch of salt for their own meager supper. You unbar the entry just wide enough to pass the requested item, exchanging a brief, guarded greeting. The street behind them is a solid wall of blackness, a stark contrast to the small sphere of light fighting for survival inside the room. A sudden gust of wind attempts to push its way inside, smelling strongly of rain in the muddy banks of the Tiber. You force the heavy oak shut again, dropping the iron bar securely into its iron brackets. The fortified nature of the dwelling provides a necessary psychological barrier against the chaotic municipality. You listen to the muffled sounds of the neighboring families through the shared stone walls. A muted argument erupts next door, the sharp tones of a merchant berating an apprentice bleeding through the porous masonry. It fades quickly, replaced by the rhythmic thump of someone repairing a piece of heavy furniture. The proximity of so many lives creates an unavoidable intimacy, a shared auditory experience that binds the community together in a web of perpetual noise. You pick up a piece of scrap leather from your pouch, using a small knife to whittle the edge into a decorative fringe. Idle hands are discouraged in this environment, driving you to find small tasks even when the primary work is concluded. The evening stretches forward, demanding careful navigation of the darkening hours. The small tallow candle gutters in its shallow dish, throwing erratic yellow light against the rough masonry of your dwelling. The flame struggles against a persistent draft, snaking through the gaps in the wooden shutters. You set aside the scrap of leather and the whittling knife, acknowledging that the ambient light is no longer sufficient for precision work. Other members of the household are already settling into their designated corners, their silhouettes blending into the deepening shadows. A heavy, wool-draped quiet descends over the room, replacing the chaotic noises of the daylight hours with a tense, expectant stillness. The physical exhaustion of the day begins to settle firmly into your bones. a familiar ache that travels from your shoulders down to your feet. Night in this crumbling metropolis is not merely the absence of the sun, it is a heavy, tangible presence that dictates every human action. You step carefully over the resting form of a younger apprentice, making your way toward the heavy oak door. The iron bar lifts with a dull scrape, allowing you to slip out into the narrow alleyway before the cold air can fully invade the room. The curfew has technically begun, but the immediate vicinity of your insula remains a tolerated gray zone for the residents. You walk the few paces to a small, irregular piazza, your turn shoes making almost no sound on the damp cobblestones. A massive block of carved travertine sits near the dry fountain, repurposed long ago as a communal bench for the neighborhood. Two older men from the adjoining building already occupy the edges of the stone, their faces illuminated intermittently by the glow of a shared clay pipe. You take a seat between them, pulling your woolen tunic tighter against the damp chill rolling off the nearby river. Above the jagged rooflines, the sky presents a startling canopy of brilliant icy stars. The absence of any widespread street lighting allows the Milky Way to arch across the heavens with stark clarity. Constellations burn against the pure blackness, appearing close enough to brush with an outstretched hand. The vastness of the cosmos stands in sharp contrast to the cramped, foul-smelling alleys of the inhabited bend. A shooting star streaks briefly across the darkness, leaving a ghostly silver trail that vanishes as quickly as it appeared. The men beside you track the celestial movement with wary eyes, reading the heavens not for beauty, but for signs and portents. In this era, the sky is a sprawling parchment, where the divine writes its warnings for those willing to pay attention. You listen as the neighbor to your right begins to speak in a hushed, urgent tone about the prophecies circulating through the city. He recounts the latest sermons referencing the book of Revelation, his voice tight with genuine apocalyptic dread. The Crusades in the East, the recent fall of Jerusalem to foreign armies, and the strange weather of the past season are all woven into his anxious narrative. He gestures upward with a calloused hand, pointing out formations that supposedly align with the visions of Joachim of Fior. The other man grunts in occasional agreement, puffing rhythmically on his pipe while keeping a watchful eye on the shadows. The fear of the end times is not an abstract theological concept. It is a breathing, active terror that permeates the community. You absorb their words without offering your own, feeling the weight of their conviction pressing against the cold night air. You notice the faint, irregular glow of a torch reflecting off the upper stories of the buildings at the far end of the street. The conversation on the bench halts instantly, replaced by the collective holding of breath. The heavy, measured footsteps of the night watch approach, accompanied by the clatter of wooden clubs against leather armor. These are men employed by the communal government, tasked with enforcing the curfew and deterring the most blatant thievery. They pass by the mouth of the alley without turning their heads, their torch casting wild, leaping shadows that distort the ancient architecture. The smell of burning pitch lingers long after their footsteps fade into the distance. The brief interruption serves as a stark reminder that safety in this darkness is strictly conditional. Somewhere in the distance, a rhythmic, metallic chipping breaks the quiet of the late hour. The sound carries clearly over the rooftops, unhindered by the usual clamor of the daylight markets. It is the steady strike of a chisel against stone, originating from a nearby basilica undergoing a massive renovation. The Kosmati marble workers operate even now, utilizing the quiet hours to execute their intricate geometric patterns. They are slicing thin pieces of ancient porphyry and serpentine, transforming the ruined pagan temples into a dazzling Christian mosaic. The high-pitched scrape of a trowel joins the percussive strikes, echoing like a heartbeat across the hushed neighborhoods. The city is continuously dismantling its own past to build its future, one piece of salvaged marble at a time. You stand up from the cold travertine block, your muscles protesting the sudden movement after sitting in the damp chill. The two men offer muted farewells, pulling their hoods higher as they prepare to remain a little longer under the watchful stars. The short walk back to your door requires navigating the pitch-black alley using only memory and the texture of the walls. Your hand brushes against the damp moss-covered brickwork, guiding you past an unseen puddle of stagnant water. The sheer darkness of the Roman night is a thick velvet blindfold that strips away your primary sense. A rat scurries across the toe of your shoe, its claws clicking faintly against the stone before it disappears into a drainage crack. You locate the heavy iron handle of your door solely by touch, grateful to cross the threshold into the familiar enclosed space. You secure the heavy wooden bar across the entry, testing its weight against the iron brackets to ensure it sits firmly. The interior of the dwelling is now dark, the tallow candle having burned itself out during your brief absence. You move through the room with practiced caution, avoiding the scattered tools and the resting bodies of your extended household. The air is thick with the smell of stale wood smoke, unwashed wool, and the lingering odor of the boiled cabbage from supper. A faint red glow pulses from the banked embers in the hearth, offering just enough illumination to locate your designated corner. The physical world shrinks to the boundaries of these stone walls, an isolated island floating in the vast, perilous ocean of the medieval night. The day's labor has extracted its toll, leaving behind an empty vessel ready to be refilled by the passing hours. Faith forms the invisible architecture of your mind as you kneel on the hard, packed earth beside your pallet. The evening prayer is not a public performance, but a fierce, private negotiation with the divine forces that govern this unforgiving reality. You clasp your callous hands together, resting your forehead against your knuckles in the gloom. The words are memorized Latin fragments, their precise theological meaning secondary to the rhythmic comfort of their recitation. You ask for protection against the malaria that rises from the marshes, against the sudden violence of the feuding clans, and against the eternal fires of hell depicted on the church walls. The devil is a literal prowling entity in this worldview, actively seeking to exploit any weakness in the spiritual armor. You cross yourself with a slow, deliberate motion, sealing the petitions with the ancient gesture. You shift your weight onto the rough straw mattress, the dry stalks rustling loudly in the quiet room. The floor beneath you retains a penetrating cold that the thin woolen blanket struggles to combat. Outside, a sudden shout rings out from the direction of the river, sharp and angry, followed immediately by the sound of running feet. You freeze, your heart rate elevating as you assess the proximity and nature of the potential threat. The footsteps recede rapidly, fading into the labyrinth of alleys without drawing any further outcry or the clash of steel. The incident remains an unresolved mystery, a common occurrence in a municipality devoid of an organized police force. You force your muscles to relax, accepting that survival requires ignoring the dangers that do not directly breach your own door. Memories of the ruined amphitheater you passed earlier in the week drift through your mind, unbidden and unsettling. The colossal structure of the Frangipani fortress looms in your imagination, its shattered arches resembling the broken ribs of a giant beast. The true purpose of the arena has been lost to the current generation, replaced by dark myths of demonic temples and pagan sun worship. You recall the stories of evil spirits trapped within the subterranean vaults, waiting for foolish wanderers to stray too far into the rubble. The medieval mind abhors a vacuum, filling the forgotten history of the classical world with theological terrors and supernatural dread. The ruins are not silent monuments. They are active, malevolent presences that demand caution and respect. You pull the blanket higher, seeking warmth against the chill of these superstitious thoughts. You trace the outline of a blister on your thumb, letting the physical sensation ground you in the immediate present. The leather harness sitting on the workbench will require another full day of oiling and burnishing before it meets the merchant standard. Your livelihood depends squarely on the strength of your hands and the enduring quality of your craftsmanship. The mental ledger of debts, obligations, and necessary purchases occupies the space usually reserved for peace. You must procure more beeswax from the market, and the price of grain has been climbing steadily since the last flood damaged the riverside storehouses. The margin between basic sustenance and outright starvation is perilously thin, requiring constant, exhausting vigilance. The economic realities of the 13th century allowed no room for complacency or error. You find a strange comfort in the distant, muffled rushing of the Tiber River as it pushes against the stone bridge piers. The waterway is the lifeblood and the primary menace of the settlement, a dual nature that defines the Roman experience. It carries the grain barges and the timber rafts, yet it also harbors the disease-bearing insects and the seasonal floods that drown the lower districts. The river cares nothing for the papal decrees or the noble feuds. It follows its ancient course with mindless, terrifying power. You have survived its swollen rages before, retreating to the upper floors while the muddy water claimed the ground-level workshops. The sound of its steady flow is a reminder of the permanent forces that shape the valley, outlasting emperors, senates, and popes. It is a patient, eroding presence in the dark. This period of the night stretches out with an elastic, indeterminate quality, unmeasured by the ringing of the church bells. The hours between Compline and Matins belong to a different realm, a suspended state where the rigid rules of the daylight municipality lose their grip. The darkness erases the boundaries between the wealthy palazzos and the crumbling insulae, reducing everyone to the same vulnerable blindness. It is a time for the secret movements of smugglers, the desperate prayers of the sick, and the quiet plotting of the political factions. The city holds its breath, waiting for the turning of the earth to restore the safety of visibility. You exist in this suspended pocket, a solitary mind hovering in the blackness, tethered to the world only by the rough texture of the wool and the slow rhythm of your own pulse. The night is a vast, empty canvas waiting for the morning light. You feel the chill of the earthen floor radiating upward, seeping through the thin layer of straw to touch your spine. Winter is still months away, yet the stone structures of the city possess an uncanny ability to retain the cold and amplify the dampness. A persistent ache throbs in your lower back, the accumulated legacy of years spent hunched over a cobbler's bench or a tanner's vat. The physical decay of your own body mirrors the crumbling state of the ruins surrounding you, a slow erosion of strength and resilience. There are no physicians for people of your station, only the herbal remedies of the local wise women and the unpredictable mercy of the saints. You adjust your position, seeking a hollow in the mattress that might offer slightly more support for your weary joints. Endurance is not a virtue here. It is the fundamental requirement for drawing the next breath. Shadows seem to detach themselves from the corners of the room, playing tricks on a mind deprived of visual input. The faint red glow of the hearth provides just enough illumination to turn ordinary shapes into menacing, unfamiliar forms. A draped cloak resembles a crouching intruder. A stacked pile of firewood takes on the aspect of a waiting beast. The imagination runs wild in the pitch black, fueled by the terrifying frescoes of demons and hellfire painted on the parish walls. The spiritual landscape of this era is populated by active, malicious entities that prey on the isolated and the fearful. You force yourself to focus on the rhythmic breathing of your household members, using their steady presence to anchor your thoughts against the rising tide of superstition. The battle against the unseen is waged nightly in every cramped dwelling across the 7 hills. You turn your thoughts toward the impending festival of a local patron saint, a rare splash of color on the drab calendar of survival. The upcoming feast day promises a brief suspension of the usual labors, marked by a procession through the streets and a communal gathering near the basilica. There will be music from traveling jongleurs, the smell of roasting meat that you otherwise cannot afford, and the potent, unwatered wines served by the parish guilds. These celebrations act as crucial release valves for a populace living under immense physical and psychological pressure. They offer a momentary glimpse of abundance, a fleeting taste of the paradise promised by the relentless sermons of the clergy. You anticipate the event not with earnest piety, but with a desperate, fundamental hunger for joy. The prospect of the festival serves as a beacon, guiding you through the monotonous grind of the working days. You recall the face of the German pilgrim you saw weeping near the reliquary earlier in the afternoon. His raw emotion stands in stark contrast to your own pragmatic relationship with the city's vast collection of sacred bones and fragments. To him, the crumbling capital is a gateway to the divine, the literal threshold of salvation where the blood of martyrs consecrates the dust. To you, it is a demanding, foul-smelling master that extracts your labor in exchange for a few loaves of dense bread. Yet, you cannot dismiss the power that draws thousands of desperate souls across treacherous continents just to touch a silver box. The faith of the pilgrim sustains the economy of your neighbors, providing the coins that circulate through the markets and taverns. The spiritual and the material are inextricably linked, bound together by the invisible threads of devotion and commerce. Suddenly, a deep, singular toll of a bell shatters the heavy silence of the deep night. It is the matins bell from a nearby monastery, rung by a solitary monk tasked with keeping the vigil while the rest of the world rests. The bronze note hangs in the cold air, a pure, resonant sound that seems to vibrate through the very stones of your building. It is a reminder that the machinery of the church operates unceasingly, maintaining a constant dialogue with the heavens on behalf of the populace. The single tone is not a melange, but a solemn declaration of endurance, a marker of time in a realm governed by darkness. You listen as the sound decays slowly, fading back into the omnipresent murmur of the river and the wind. The brief interruption reinforces the scale of the eternal city, a place where prayer and stone outlast the fragile lives of its inhabitants. You cross your arms over your chest, holding the coarse wool tightly against your body to conserve whatever warmth remains. The deepest part of the night has arrived, the hours where the temperature plummets and the dampness becomes a physical ache. This is the time when the fevers of the malaria sufferers spike and the fragile lives of the infants hang in the balance. The city is a crucible, testing the limits of human endurance with every passing season and every failed harvest. Yet, there is a stubborn, irrational resilience woven into the fabric of the Roman people, a refusal to abandon the ruins of their ancestors. You share in that collective stubbornness, drawing strength from the sheer bloody-minded persistence of your lineage. The darkness holds no new terrors that your kind has not already faced and survived. You trace the fading resonance of the monastery bell in your mind, following the sound through the winding streets to its source on the Aventine Hill. The monks stand in the freezing choir of their basilica, their breath forming pale clouds in the frigid air. They wear heavy wool habits that provide meager defense against the stone's pervasive chill. Tall beeswax tapers cast a warm, localized glow over the thick vellum pages of their psalters. Ink made from oak galls spells out the ancient Latin verses they have memorized over decades of repetition. Their voices blend into a single rolling instrument that pushes back against the silence of the abandoned neighborhoods. The city relies on this spiritual labor just as heavily as it relies on the baker's oven or the blacksmith's forge. Shadows leap in retreat along the nave as the drafts cast the candle flames. The mosaic saints hovering in the apse seem to shift and move, their golden backgrounds catching the sparse illumination. These holy men maintain the watch while the secular population huddles under coarse blankets in the valleys below. Their schedule breaks the night into manageable segments, defying the natural human instinct to succumb to the dark. The cold seeps upward through the soles of their sandals, a physical mortification accepted as part of the monastic bargain. You imagine the precise, rhythmic motions of the cosmati artisans working in a different church across the river. The sharp, high-pitched scrape of an iron saw biting into ancient marble echoes in the empty nave. Water and coarse sand serve as friction, gradually wearing a clean slice through a block of green serpentine salvaged from a ruined bathhouse. Torches mounted on iron brackets spit sparks onto the dusty floorboards, providing the necessary light for their exacting craft. The master cutter measures the angle of a tiny triangular piece, ensuring it will interlock flawlessly with the surrounding pattern. The dust coats their hands and faces, turning them into pale ghosts laboring in the belly of a stone whale. They are building a new civilization from the shattered bones of the old. Grit covers everything in the construction zone, a fine powder that tastes of lime and antiquity. The lime kiln burns just outside the portico, producing a steady, dull heat and an acrid odor that wafts through the open doorways. Unwanted classical statuary feeds the roaring fire, the sculpted marble breaking down into the basic chemical components needed for fresh mortar. A laborer feeds another broken column drum into the pit, shielding his face from the fierce thermal updraft. The transformation is ruthless and necessary, erasing the pagan past to secure the Christian present. You consider the men tasked with walking the perimeter of the crumbling urban sprawl. The night watch patrols the Aurelian walls, moving in pairs along the uneven brick ramparts constructed 9 centuries prior. Their leather boots slip on the damp moss that flourishes in the cracks of the forgotten defenses. A simple iron lantern swings from the end of a wooden pole, casting a feeble circle of safety around their progress. They hold short spears, the polished metal tips catching the starlight as they scan the vast, empty tracts of land enclosed within the fortifications. Rome is a shrunken kernel rattling inside an oversized shell, leaving huge swaths of territory untamed and unlit. The guards fear the silent, weed-choked vineyards far more than they fear the crowded residential alleys. Wind howls through the empty archways of the distant Colosseum, sounding remarkably like a chorus of damned souls. The guards cross themselves whenever their patrol route brings them within sight of the massive, ruined amphitheater. Local legends claim the subterranean vaults house demons and forgotten pagan deities waiting for the unwary traveler. The true history of gladiatorial combat has vanished from the municipal memory, replaced by elaborate superstitions and theological dread. The watchmen hurry past the dark gaps in the masonry, eager to return to the populated sectors where the scent of wood smoke proves the presence of other living mortals. The architecture of the ancients serves only to intimidate the descendants who inherited it. You project your thoughts further outward, past the heavy timber gates and into the desolate expanse of the Campagna. The great plain surrounding the city is a haunted wilderness of marshland, ruined aqueducts, and scrubby pastures. Semi-nomadic cattle herders, the tough men who supply the urban butchers, sit around a low scrub oak fire in the open fields. Their rough sheepskin cloaks ward off the penetrating dampness rising from the saturated soil. A large mastiff-like dog raises its head, growling softly into the blackness beyond the firelight. Wolves roam this territory freely, bold enough to test the perimeter of the herd when the winter scarcity begins to bite. The herder tosses a thick branch onto the embers, sending a shower of orange sparks spiraling up toward the icy constellations. By this hour, the malarial mosquitoes have ceased their most active hunting, though the threat of the invisible fever always lingers in the low-lying valleys. The herders know the dangerous zones, avoiding the stagnant pools that breed the sickness they call the bad air. They rely on cheap wine and raw garlic to ward off the chills, lacking access to even the rudimentary herbalism found within the city walls. A restless bull snorts in the darkness, the sound carrying clearly across the flat, open ground. The men murmur to each other in a coarse dialect, their voices blending with the rustle of the dry grass. Their existence is harsh, stripped of the minor comforts that define the urban struggle, yet they possess a raw freedom denied to the inhabitants of the cramped insulae. You focus on the steady, inexorable flow of the Tiber River cutting through the center of the settlement. The muddy water churns around the wooden hulls of the floating mills tethered near the bridges. The massive water wheels continue their rotation, even in the pitch blackness, the river providing an endless source of mechanical power. The heavy millstones grind grain into coarse flour, a relentless, booming vibration that rattles the nearby stone embankments. A solitary worker stands on the deck of the anchored barge, using a long pole to clear river debris from the churning wooden paddles. The water smells of silt, decay, and the brine of the distant sea. The current shows no mercy to the careless, easily dragging a man under the surface before a cry for help can be raised. Woven wicker traps sit submerged along the shallow banks, catching the fat eels that navigate the murky depths. The fishermen will haul them up at first light, providing a crucial source of protein for the numerous fasting days mandated by the church calendar. The river is both a sewer and a larder, a paradox that the population accepts without question. The cold wind blowing off the water carries a sharp, metallic tang that settles into the fibers of the woolen garments. The floating mills groan against their thick hemp mooring ropes, straining as the current surges from recent rains in the northern hills. The Tiber is the artery that sustains the city, demanding constant respect and a wary vigilance from those who harvest its bounty. You pull your knees closer to your chest, tucking the thin blanket tighter around your shoulders. The draft creeping under the heavy oak door carries a fresh wave of that riverside dampness into the room. A rat scuttles across the far corner of the packed earth floor, its tiny claws clicking a rapid, erratic rhythm before finding a hole in the masonry. You do not bother to chase it away, conserving your energy for the physical demands that await the dawn. The vermin are permanent residents, multiplying in the shadows and scavenging the scraps dropped from the wooden tables. Coexistence is the only viable strategy in a dwelling that offers infinite hiding places within its crumbling walls. Silence is an illusion in this densely packed urban environment, merely a shift from the loud clamor of commerce to the subtle noises of human survival. A sudden, sharp cough erupts from the apprentice sleeping a few paces away, a wet, hacking sound that speaks of fluids settling in the lungs. The respiratory ailments are ubiquitous, fostered by the perpetual wood smoke trapped in the unventilated rooms and the seasonal chilling of the stone. The wife stirs in her sleep, murmuring a fragmented prayer before subsiding back into the stillness. The air inside the chamber feels thick and used, redolent with the smell of unwashed bodies and the lingering ghost of the tallow candle. You breathe shallowly, accustomed to the heavy atmosphere that defines the indoor experience. You listen to the distant, muffled barking of a stray dog echoing through the labyrinth of the merchant quarter. The feral packs roam the alleys unchecked, surviving on the refuse tossed from the upper windows and the occasional scrap from a sympathetic butcher. They serve as an unofficial alarm system, raising their voices whenever the night watch or a band of thieves moves too aggressively through their territory. The barking triggers a brief response from a neighboring hound before dying away into an uneasy quiet. The hierarchy of the streets applies to the animals as strictly as it applies to the noble families. Only the strong maintain their designated ground, while the weak are forced to the margins. Though the threat of the invisible fever always lingers in the low-lying valleys, the herders know the dangerous zones, avoiding the stagnant pools that breed the sickness they call the bad air. They rely on cheap wine and raw garlic to ward off the chills, lacking access to even the rudimentary herbalism found within the city walls. A restless bull snorts in the darkness, the sound carrying clearly across the flat, open ground. The men murmur to each other in a coarse dialect, their voices blending with the rustle of the dry grass. Their existence is harsh, stripped of the minor comforts that define the urban struggle, yet they possess a raw freedom denied to the inhabitants of the cramped insulae. You focus on the steady, inexorable flow of the Tiber River cutting through the center of the settlement. The muddy water churns around the wooden hulls of the floating mills tethered near the bridges. The massive water wheels continue their rotation even in the pitch blackness, the river providing an endless source of mechanical power. The heavy millstones grind grain into coarse flour, a relentless booming vibration that rattles the nearby stone embankments. A solitary worker stands on the deck of the anchored barge, using a long pole to clear river debris from the churning wooden paddles. The water smells of silt, decay, and the brine of the distant sea. The current shows no mercy to the careless, easily dragging a man under the surface before a cry for help can be raised. Woven wicker traps sit submerged along the shallow banks, catching the fat eels that navigate the murky depths. The fishermen will haul them up at first light, providing a crucial source of protein for the numerous fasting days mandated by the church calendar. The river is both a sewer and a larder, a paradox that the population accepts without question. The cold wind blowing off the water carries a sharp metallic tang that settles into the fibers of the woolen garments. The floating mills groan against their thick hemp mooring ropes, straining as the current surges from recent rains in the northern hills. The Tiber is the artery that sustains the city, demanding constant respect and a wary vigilance from those who harvest its bounty. You pull your knees closer to your chest, tucking the thin blanket tighter around your shoulders. The draft creeping under the heavy oak door carries a fresh wave of that riverside dampness into the room. A rat scuttles across the far corner of the packed earth floor, its tiny claws clicking a rapid, erratic rhythm before finding a hole in the masonry. You do not bother to chase it away, conserving your energy for the physical demands that await the dawn. The vermin are permanent residents, multiplying in the shadows and scavenging the scraps dropped from the wooden tables. Coexistence is the only viable strategy in a dwelling that offers infinite hiding places within its crumbling walls. Silence is an illusion in this densely packed urban environment, merely a shift from the loud clamor of commerce to the subtle noises of human survival. A sudden, sharp cough erupts from the apprentice sleeping a few paces away, a wet, hacking sound that speaks of fluids settling in the lungs. The respiratory ailments are ubiquitous, fostered by the perpetual wood smoke trapped in the unventilated rooms and the seasonal chilling of the stone. The wife stirs in her sleep, murmuring a fragmented prayer before subsiding back into the stillness. The air inside the chamber feels thick and used, redolent with the smell of unwashed bodies and the lingering ghost of the tallow candle. You breathe shallowly, accustomed to the heavy atmosphere that defines the indoor experience. You listen to the distant, muffled barking of a stray dog echoing through the labyrinth of the merchant quarter. The feral packs roam the alleys unchecked, surviving on the refuse tossed from the upper windows and the occasional scrap from a sympathetic butcher. They serve as an unofficial alarm system, raising their voices whenever the night watch or a band of thieves moves too aggressively through their territory. The barking triggers a brief response from a neighboring hound before dying away into an uneasy quiet. The hierarchy of the streets applies to the animals as strictly as it applies to the noble families. Only the strong maintain their designated ground, while the weak are forced to the margins. Frost begins to form on the exposed surfaces outside, a thin crystalline layer coating the wooden rain barrels and the edges of the travertine benches. The temperature drop is severe, driving the last of the vagrants into whatever sheltered alcoves they can claim. A small group of pilgrims, lacking the funds for a proper hostelry, huddled together in the deep portico of a parish church near the river. They share their woolen cloaks, attempting to preserve the collective body heat against the penetrating cold. Their dreams are likely filled with the golden reliquaries they traveled so far to touch, finding spiritual warmth where physical comfort is absent. The city is a harsh host, testing the faithful with physical suffering to temper their devotion. You envision the vast subterranean network of the catacombs extending beneath the ancient roads leading out of the gates. These tunnels hold the bones of the early martyrs, a silent, hidden city of the dead that mirrors the chaotic settlement of the living above. The entrances are mostly sealed or lost to memory, overgrown by the scrub brush of the Campania. The sheer volume of human remains resting beneath the soil contributes to the pervasive sense of a haunted landscape. The medieval Romans believed these sacred dead continued to influence the affairs of the mortal realm, acting as a spiritual shield against the forces of darkness. The ground itself is saturated with history, blood, and the literal dust of generations. Footsteps pass directly outside the shuttered window of your insula, moving with a deliberate, stealthy caution. You hold your breath, tracking the faint sound as it moves toward the intersection at the end of the block. A quiet exchange of voices follows. Too low to discern the words, but the tone implies a clandestine negotiation. The illicit economy thrives in these hours, dealing in stolen goods, untaxed wine, and the secrets traded between the rival noble houses. A heavy sack thumps softly against the cobblestones. Then the footsteps resume their path away from your dwelling. You release the breath slowly, satisfied that the intrusion has passed without incident. The night is a river of hidden activity flowing past the barred doors of the cautious majority. You turn your thoughts toward the monumental fortress of the Castel Sant'Angelo, the cylindrical tomb of a forgotten emperor, now serving as the papal stronghold. High above the river, armed sentries walk the wide stone battlements, their cloaks whipping in the strong winds that funnel down the Tiber Valley. The fortress represents the ultimate secular power of the church, a secure fallback position when the factional violence in the streets threatens the papal court. The massive bronze doors are bolted from the inside, sealing off a self-contained citadel capable of withstanding a prolonged siege. The wealth stored within those thick walls, the gold bullion, the diplomatic correspondence, the most precious relics, is staggering. It is the impregnable heart of the political apparatus that governs the spiritual lives of millions. Before the next bell rings, the bakers must begin their preparation for the coming dawn. You picture the large, cavernous bakeries where the dough has been resting in enormous wooden troughs. The master baker and his assistants move through the flour-dusted workspace, dividing the massive mound into individual loaves. The heat radiating from the great brick ovens provides a sharp contrast to the freezing temperature of the street outside. They work with a practiced, sweeping rhythm, shaping the coarse grain mixture with hands that move too fast to follow. The survival of the populace depends on this nocturnal labor, a guaranteed supply of the dense, heavy bread that forms the foundation of the Roman diet. Their sweat falls into the dough, an unavoidable consequence of the intense physical exertion. You feel a dull throb in your left temple, a minor echo of the malarial headache that periodically ravages your system. The parasite is a permanent resident in your blood, lying dormant during the colder months only to surge again when the spring rains swell the marshes. You press 2 fingers against the pulse point, willing the discomfort to subside. There is no remedy available beyond the bitter willow bark tea provided by the old woman in the next parish, and you lack the coin to purchase it tonight. You must endure the pain, trusting the hardened resilience of your body to weather the minor flare-up. Weakness is an unaffordable luxury when the workbench demands your full capacity just to earn the daily bread. Wood groans under the strain of the shifting temperature, the heavy timber beams of the insula settling deeper into their masonry pockets. The building is a living entity, expanding and contracting with the weather, shedding flakes of plaster and dust in a constant, slow decay. A loose roof tile slides with a harsh scrape, tumbling into the alley below and shattering upon the cobblestones. The sudden noise startles the cat hunting near the rain barrel, sending it scrambling up the rough brickwork to safety. The structural integrity of these dwellings is a matter of perpetual concern, a delicate balance maintained by impromptu repairs and hopeful neglect. The city is continually falling apart and being patched back together in an endless cycle of degradation and recovery. You map the geography of the nearby forms in your mind, tracing the paths between the ruined columns where the cattle are currently penned. The massive herds brought in from the Campania wait in makeshift enclosures among the classical debris, their nervous movements churning the earth into a thick, foul-smelling mud. The butchers will arrive at first light to begin the slaughter, an industrial-scale operation that will turn the soil red and fill the air with the metallic scent of fresh blood. The necessity of the work does not lessen the grim reality of the process, a brutal harvest of flesh required to feed the wealthier tables of the settlement. The contrast between the majestic marble ruins and the visceral reality of the livestock market captures the essence of the medieval transition. The grand public spaces of the empire are now the utilitarian workyards of the working class. Flames crackle suddenly in the hearth as a pocket of sap in the remaining log catches fire, casting a brief, bright flare across the packed earth floor. The sudden illumination reveals the scattered tools you left near the bench: the curved knife, the wooden mallet, the iron awl resting on a scrap of raw hide. These instruments are the physical extension of your will, the means by which you force raw material into useful shapes. Without them, you are merely another beggar waiting by the church steps for a coin from a passing pilgrim. The tools require constant maintenance, the blades sharpened and the wooden handles oiled against the cracking dampness. They are your most valuable possessions, a tangible guarantee of your continued utility in a ruthless economic system. You listen as the wind picks up speed, howling down the narrow funnel of the alleyway and rattling the heavy wooden shutter. The weather in this valley is prone to sudden, violent shifts, bringing torrential rains that turn the streets into rushing streams of filth. You hope the roof holds against the approaching front, knowing that a leak will quickly ruin the processed leather waiting for delivery. The elements are a constant adversary, indifferent to the struggles of the artisans and the edicts of the senators. The human endeavor is merely a temporary imposition on the landscape, a fragile construction constantly threatened by the forces of nature. You pull the woolen blanket up to your chin, guarding the small pocket of warmth against the invading chill. Shadows deepen as the sudden flare in the hearth burns itself out, returning the room to its former state of profound gloom. The pulse of the city is slowed to its absolute minimum, a faint, barely discernible heartbeat, barely under the weight of the stone and the dark. The overlapping jurisdictions of the popes, the nobles, and the senate hold no sway in these hours, their political maneuvering suspended by the biological necessity of rest. The inhabitants are reduced to their fundamental state, vulnerable, cold, and waiting for the rotation of the earth to bring the sun back over the Sabine hills. The collective vulnerability creates a silent, unacknowledged bond among the populace, a shared endurance against the terrifying scale of the medieval night. You recognize the faint, rhythmic dripping of condensation falling from the roof beams into a puddle near the door. The sound acts as a natural metronome, measuring the slow passage of time in the absence of the church bells. Each drop marks another fraction of the night successfully navigated, another small victory in the ongoing campaign of survival. The mental ledger of fears and obligations begins to blur, the sharp edges of anxiety softened by the sheer length of the vigil. You remain a fixed point in the center of the sprawling, ruined capital, a testament to the stubborn persistence of the human animal. The darkness is absolute, stretching out across the 7 hills, holding the eternal city in its quiet, freezing grip. You breathe in the sharp, medicinal scent of dried herbs and boiling water as you project your thoughts toward the monastic infirmary. This sanctuary of suffering operates in the deepest hours of the dark, tucked safely behind the thick brick walls of a major religious house. Rows of simple wooden pallets line a long stone hall, each holding a patient fighting the invisible internal battles of the blood. A monk in a coarse brown habit moves quietly between the beds, carrying a ceramic bowl of steaming willow bark tea. The dim light of a single oil lamp casts long, wavering shadows across the vaulted ceiling, distorting the simple architecture into something vast and looming. This isolated chamber serves as the front line of the city's perpetual war against the marsh fevers. You watch the brother kneel beside a shaking figure, his movements practiced and steady despite the late hour. He lifts the patient's head gently, coaxing the bitter liquid past cracked lips while reciting a low, rhythmic Latin prayer. The theology of healing in this era demands strict attention to both the flesh and the soul simultaneously. Physical illness is considered inseparable from spiritual imbalance, requiring a dual approach of herbal remedies and divine intercession to achieve any lasting cure. The patient coughs, a weak rattling sound that echoes off the hard masonry before sinking back into the rustling straw mattress. The monk makes the sign of the cross over the damp forehead, picks up his ceramic bowl, and moves silently to the next suffering soul. Medical texts written in precise, blocky script rest on a heavy wooden lectern near the entrance of the ward. These bound volumes contain the translated wisdom of ancient Greek physicians, preserved through centuries of upheaval by the dedicated copying of the scribes. The brothers studied the theories of the four humors diligently, striving to balance blood, phlegm, and bile through restricted diets and careful bleeding. Small clay jars line the rough wooden shelves, holding dried roots, powdered minerals, and pungent salves derived from generations of painful trial and error. The air in the infirmary feels heavy with accumulated misery and the desperate quiet hope of recovery. Survival here depends as much on the innate resilience of the human body as it does on the contents of those mysterious jars. You shift your attention away from the cloister, moving toward the muddy banks of the slow-moving river to observe the nocturnal harvest. The water reflects the starlight in fractured, oily segments, hiding the treacherous currents beneath the opaque surface. A solitary fisherman maneuvers a flat-bottomed skiff through the shallows, using a long ash pole to avoid the hidden sandbars and submerged debris. The cold bites through his layered wool tunics, stiffening his fingers as he reaches bare-handed into the freezing current. He searches for the submerged ropes attached to his wicker eel traps, relying entirely on touch in the visual void of the river valley. The Tiber yields its bounty reluctantly, exacting a steep toll of numbness and constant physical danger from those who work its waters. You hear the wet, heavy splash as the first woven basket breaks the surface of the river and clears the current. The fisherman hauls the trap over the wooden gunwale, water cascading from the gaps in the reeds to pool around his leather boots. Inside the wicker cage, thick, muscular bodies writhe and slap against the confines, a successful catch destined for the morning markets. He transfers the wriggling mass into a secure holding barrel, his hands moving with blind, practiced efficiency to avoid their snapping jaws. The demand for fish peaks during the numerous fast days mandated by the liturgical calendar, making this brutal, freezing labor an economic necessity. He drops the empty trap back into the dark water, already pushing the ash pole into the mud to navigate toward the next floating marker. Downstream from the skiff, the massive wooden structures of the floating mills loom like anchored islands in the rushing current. The heavy paddles continue their endless rotation, groaning under the immense pressure of the flowing water pushing against the broad blades. A tethered barge shifts against its thick hip mooring ropes, the wet wood creaking in loud protest against the relentless force of the river. Inside the protective mill housing, massive circular stones grind grain into coarse flour, producing a constant, bone-rattling vibration that shakes the entire vessel. The solitary miller works by the light of a shielded lantern, checking the feed hoppers and adjusting the tension on the grinding mechanisms. White dust coats his hair and eyelashes, turning him into a pale specter haunting the churning wooden machinery. You step away from the damp riverbank, drawn toward the faint, yeast-scented warmth radiating from a nearby commercial bakery. The heavy iron doors of the massive brick ovens stand wide open, revealing roaring fires fueled by bundles of dry brush and split oak. The master baker stands before a massive wooden trough, his muscular arms buried to the elbows in a thick gray mound of dough. He turns and folds the mixture with rhythmic, punishing force, working the gluten to ensure a proper rise in the finished loaves. Heat rolls off the heated masonry in visible waves, creating a stifling microclimate that banishes the winter chill entirely from the room. This grueling physical exertion forms the invisible foundation supporting the diet of thousands of sleeping citizens. An apprentice hurries past the master carrying a stack of flat wooden peels, his face flushed and shining with sweat. He begins portioning the massive mound of dough, tearing off specific chunks and rolling them into uniform spheres with rapid, practiced motions. The loaves are set aside to rest on flour-dusted boards, waiting for the brick ovens to reach their optimal baking temperature. The air smells sharply of fermentation, wood, ash, and the salty metallic tang of intense human labor. There is no room for error in this precise process. A ruined batch means lost coin, wasted firewood, and hungry neighbors. The bakery functions as a vital organ within the city's anatomy, pumping essential sustenance into the surrounding arteries of the streets. You walk the perimeter of the affluent merchant district, where the towering stone manors of the nobility cast long, impenetrable shadows. A squad of armed retainers loyal to the Colonna clan stands watch near a heavy iron gate, their cloaks pulled tight against the rising wind. They speak in low, guarded tones, exchanging rumors of shifting alliances and the recent bloody skirmishes near the Pantheon. The political machinery of the municipality never truly sleeps, operating through whispers, bribes, and covert meetings in the darkest hours. A drop coin clinks loudly against the cobblestones, prompting the guards to reach instinctively for the worn pommels of their swords. Trust is a rare commodity in these contested neighborhoods, replaced by a paranoid vigilance that treats every shadow as a potential assassin. You observe a lone figure working in an upper room of a building near the Papal Administrative Center, the light from his window cutting through the gloom. A scribe sits hunched over a sloped wooden desk, his sharpened quill scratching steadily across a sheet of prepared parchment. He copies a legal decree concerning the regulation of the pilgrim hostels, his eyes straining in the dim light of a single beeswax taper. The dark ink forms a stark contrast against the pale animal skin, recording the bureaucratic decisions that shape the physical reality of the citizens below. His fingers are stained a permanent mottled black, the visible physical mark of his highly specialized profession. The power of the written word emanates from these quiet, focused labors, extending the reach and authority of the curia across the entire continent. You walk past the noxious operations of the tanneries situated along the river's edge, where the smell of decay remains a permanent fixture. Massive wooden vats sink deep into the muddy ground, filled with caustic mixtures of urine and lime used to strip the hair from animal hides. The dark liquid sits perfectly still in the absence of the daytime laborers, emitting a harsh vapor that stings the eyes and burns the back of the throat. Processing the skins requires weeks of foul, back-breaking effort, transforming the raw slaughterhouse byproduct into supple, valuable leather. The neighborhood avoids this stretch of the bank whenever possible, surrendering the territory to the artisans who have sacrificed their sense of smell for their livelihood. This brutal alchemy is the hidden cost of the belts, harnesses, and shoes worn by the populace. You notice a subtle shift in the wind, a sudden drop in pressure that carries the unmistakable scent of approaching rain. The autumn storms possess the power to turn the docile Tiber into a raging, destructive force within a matter of hours, threatening the low-lying artisan quarters. Debris begins to rattle down the narrow alleys, driven by sudden gusts that strip the last remaining leaves from the scattered elm trees. A loose wooden shutter slams repeatedly against a brick facade, a sharp, percussive sound that mimics the crack of a drover's whip. The inhabitants of the ground floor workshops know the signs intimately, mentally preparing for the arduous task of moving their tools and materials to higher ground. The environment functions as an active, unpredictable adversary demanding constant respect and rapid, exhausting adaptation. You turn your gaze toward the massive, broken ring of the ancient amphitheater, standing isolated and majestic against the starless sky. The wind howls through the empty archways, creating a low, mournful tone that sounds like the earth itself is groaning under the weight of the stone. Lightning flashes briefly on the horizon, throwing the colossal silhouette into sharp, sudden relief before plunging it back into the abyss. The Frangipani guards stationed in their makeshift timber fortifications within the ruins huddle close to their braziers, cursing the sudden drop in temperature. They watch the shadows with superstitious dread, fearing the legendary demons said to haunt the subterranean vaults below the arena floor. The ruins serve as a constant physical reminder of a lost golden age, mocking the fragile, squabbling factions of the present era. You feel the solid earth beneath your feet, and remember the vast hidden necropolis extending for miles outside the city walls. The catacombs form a mirror image of the settlement above, a silent, orderly city of the dead carved directly into the soft volcanic tufa. Passages stretch into the absolute blackness, lined with thousands of rectangular niches holding the bones of the early martyrs and forgotten generations. The air down there is cool, dry, and perfectly still, untouched by the biting winds or the torrential rains that plague the surface. The medieval mind draws deep comfort from this subterranean army of saints, believing their presence forms a spiritual barrier against the predations of the devil. The boundary between the living and the dead feels remarkably porous in this place, a thin veil separating the struggling present from the eternal quiet. You retreat toward the relative safety of your own insula, the cold seeping aggressively through the worn gaps in your woolen tunic. The vast ruined landscape of the eternal city surrounds you, a complicated maze of dismantled temples and fortified towers bracing against the incoming weather. The deep night maintains its grip firmly, denying any premature hint of the dawn that feels impossibly far away. The populace endures this suspension of time, locked away in their smoky, crowded chambers while the nocturnal workers carry the heavy burden of survival. You rest your hand against the rough, freezing stone of your doorway, acknowledging the fragile boundary between the harsh external world and the precarious sanctuary within. The cycle of endurance demands everything from its participants, offering only the grim promise of another arduous day in return. You pull your knees tighter to your chest, feeling the coarse weave of the undyed wool scratch uncomfortably against your bare skin. The cold has become a tangible entity within the small room, a heavy oppressive presence that presses down on the huddled forms of your sleeping household. The single wooden shutter rattles violently against its iron latch, driven by a sudden gust of wind that smells strongly of river mud and crushed wet leaves. You listen to the rhythmic, shallow breathing of the apprentice sleeping mere inches from your feet, his small frame curled into a tight knot of biological preservation. This shared endurance forms the unspoken bond of the crumbling insula, a collective, silent resistance against a freezing, indifferent night. The packed earth floor seems to absorb whatever meager warmth your shivering body manages to generate. Beyond the thin plaster and damp brick, the sprawling neighborhood of Trastevere remains locked in a tense, suspended silence. Water drips relentlessly from the overhanging timber eaves, pooling in the muddy, deep ruts left by the heavy daytime carts. The narrow, winding alleys across the river hold a much different character than the bustling markets of the Campus Martius, harboring a dense, insular community that guards its secrets jealously. A stray dog whines from the meager shelter of a collapsed portico, seeking any possible refuge from the biting wind whipping off the Tiber. The mud here is darker and slicker, mixed with the noxious refuse of the tanneries and the potteries that line the western bank. The river acts as a psychological and physical barrier, isolating the entire district in the pitch blackness. You shift your weight cautiously, trying intensely not to disturb the dry, rustling straw of your flattened pallet. Every minor movement feels exaggerated in the absolute dark, amplified by the echoing acoustics of the stone chamber. Your fingers trace the familiar, jagged edge of a chipped brick near your head, filling out a tactile map of your immediate physical boundaries. The city outside feels impossibly vast and overtly hostile, a labyrinth of decaying ruins and factional strongholds waiting for the sun to reveal their imposing shapes. You close your eyes, though it makes absolutely no difference to your vision, and focus on the faint, steady pulse beating at your own wrist. Life in this brutal era is measured in these small, quiet increments of survival and endurance. Far away from your quiet street, torches burn low in the newly expanded wards of Santo Spirito near the Vatican walls. The hospital stands as a testament to the papal court's vast wealth and its mandate to care for the vulnerable, functioning tirelessly through the freezing hours. Nuns in heavy woolen habits glide over the polished stone floors, adjusting rough blankets and offering sips of watered wine to the feverish travelers. The smell of burning beeswax mingles heavily with the sharp odor of sickness and the earthy, damp scent of unwashed pilgrim cloaks. A choir of novice monks maintains a continuous, low chant in the adjoining chapel, their harmonized voices intended to soothe both the physical and spiritual agonies of the patients. The papacy extends its massive influence through this organized mercy, anchoring its absolute power in the physical salvation of the desperate. You swallow against the painfully dry throat, tasting the lingering bitter grit of yesterday's hearth ash on your tongue. The deep desire for a cup of water wars constantly with the extreme reluctance to leave the meager pocket of body heat you have managed to cultivate under the blanket. You decide firmly against the excursion, knowing the clay pitcher sits near the drafty door where the water will be shockingly, teeth-achingly cold. Instead, you press your freezing nose against the wool, trapping your own exhaled breath to temporarily warm your face. The rigid discipline of the medieval body is forged in these minor, constant denials, a perpetual suppression of comfort in favor of raw endurance. You count the slow, heavy beats of your heart, using the internal rhythm to anchor your wandering, anxious mind. Wind sweeps unimpeded across the desolate heights of the Palatine Hill, bending the overgrown cypress trees and rustling the thick, invasive ivy. The sprawling, shattered palaces of the ancient emperors sit completely abandoned, their massive vaulted ceilings open entirely to the indifferent, icy stars. Owls hunt silently among the crumbling brick corridors, their pale wings flashing briefly against the darkness as they swoop down upon unsuspecting rodents. The exquisite marble floors that once felt the leather sandals of senators are now buried under centuries of accumulated soil and decomposing vegetation. This majestic decay stands as the ultimate memento mori for the current generation, a towering reminder that all human ambition eventually returns to the dirt. The night claims these ruins entirely, transforming them into a terrifying wilderness at the very center of the civilization. You run a callous thumb over the rough knuckles of your opposite hand, feeling the raised, permanent scars left by the leatherworking tools. Your body is a living, breathing ledger of your trade, marked by the inevitable slips of the curved knife and the repetitive friction of the heavy iron awl. These physical imperfections are quiet points of pride, tangible evidence of your ability to contribute effectively to the household's economy. Without the hardened skin and the highly specialized muscle memory, you would be entirely defenseless against the crushing poverty that lines the city's overflowing gutters. You flex your fingers slowly, ensuring the joints remain loose despite the penetrating damp cold. The workbench will demand their absolute painful flexibility long before the frost melts from the morning paving stones. Along the southern stretch of the Aurelian walls, near the massive fortifications of the Porta Appia, the communal night watch performs its slow, miserable circuit. The guards march deliberately along the elevated brick sentry path, their heavy wool cloaks snapping violently in the relentless wind. They carry iron braziers suspended from long wooden poles, the burning coals providing a meager defense against the elements and a warning beacon to any approaching bandits. The vast, empty expanse of the Campagna stretches out beyond the heavy timber gates, a sea of absolute blackness harboring untold, hidden dangers. The sentries peer nervously into the void, their eyes watering from the blowing smoke and the biting chill, looking for any unauthorized movement on the ancient Roman highway. Their vigilance secures the sleeping population, a necessary physical barrier matching the spiritual barrier of the monastic prayers. You hear the unmistakable, heavy scratching of a rat working its way frantically through a rotting floorboard near the dead hearth. The sound is highly localized and incredibly persistent, a frantic gnawing that grates terribly against the enforced quiet of the room. You reach blindly for a small, smooth throwing stone kept nearby for exactly this purpose, your fingers closing tightly around the cold river rock. With a sudden, forceful flick of your wrist, you send the stone skittering aggressively across the packed earth toward the irritating noise. A sharp squeak and the immediate panic scrambling of tiny claws confirm a successful deterrent, returning the dark corner to complete silence. You settle back into your hollow on the mattress, briefly satisfied with the minor, temporary territorial victory. Inside the fortified, heavily guarded compound of the Orsini family, the atmosphere remains tense and alert. Despite the incredibly late hour, dozens of armed retainers occupy the lower stone halls, sleeping in brief shifts on wooden benches, with their unsheathed weapons close at hand. The ongoing bloody feud with the rival Colonna faction dictates this permanent state of martial readiness, turning the noble residence into a paranoid armed camp. A massive fire roars in the central fireplace, illuminating the expensive tapestries depicting violent hunting scenes that hang on the cold stone walls. Two captains sit near the hearth, speaking in low, urgent voices while tracing strategic routes on a rough parchment map of the city districts. The fragile peace of the night is merely a tactical pause in a continuous, slow-motion war for complete dominance over the municipal government. You let out a long, highly controlled breath, watching the faint white plume of vapor dissipate rapidly in the dim red glow of the dying embers. The cold has finally permeated the deepest layers of your clothing, settling firmly into your bones with an inescapable, aching heaviness. You draw your knees even closer to your chest, compressing your physical form into the absolute smallest possible target for the freezing, creeping draft. The sheer length of the winter night feels incredibly oppressive, a malicious stretching of time that severely tests the psychological limits of the entire population. You wait for the turning of the earth with a stoic, wordless patience, knowing perfectly well that the eventual dawn is the only guaranteed reprieve. The brutal endurance of the dark is the shared, completely silent labor of the entire city. Rushing waters of the Tiber violently embrace the boat-shaped mass of the Tiber Island, splitting aggressively into two distinct, churning channels. The ancient bridges connecting the island to the mainland groan audibly under the constant hydraulic pressure, their massive stone piers resisting the relentless force as they have for millennium. A small hospital occupies the center of the landmass, built directly over the ruined foundations of a classical temple originally dedicated to healing. The solitary light of a votive candle burns in a narrow, high window, casting a faint, trembling reflection across the black, turbulent river. This isolated sanctuary exists in a permanent, unhealthy state of dampness, the air thick with the smell of wet stone and freezing river mist. The island stands as a stubborn, immovable fortress against the current, a physical manifestation of the city's absolute refusal to be swept away. You press your hands flat against the mattress, feeling the incredibly coarse, uneven texture of the woven straw beneath your calloused palms. A sudden, sharp cramp seizes your right calf, the muscle locking tightly and painfully in response to the freezing temperature and the day's intense physical exertion. You bite the inside of your cheek violently to stifle a loud groan, extending the leg forcefully and massaging the knotted tissue with urgent, deep pressure. The pain is bright and immediate, a sudden flare of pure agony that completely shatters the numbing monotony of the freezing cold. You work the stubborn muscle until it slowly releases its iron grip, leaving behind a dull, throbbing ache that pulses precisely in time with your heartbeat. The physical body demands constant, painful maintenance and attention, penalizing any minor neglect with swift, sharp reminders of its total vulnerability. Heavy rain finally begins to fall, announcing its sudden arrival with a scattered, percussive tapping against the wooden shutters and clay roof tiles. The drops are massive and freezing, carrying the icy, unforgiving breath of the Apennine Mountains down into the sheltered Tiber Valley. Within minutes, the sporadic tapping escalates rapidly into a steady, driving downpour that instantly turns the dirt alleys into slick, treacherous rivers of mud. Water cascades violently from the overhanging eaves in thick, continuous sheets, flooding the central drainage channels and washing away the accumulated noxious filth of the markets. The deafening sound of the storm drowns out the river and the wind, creating a roaring, white noise isolation that seals every single dwelling into its own private, terrifying universe. The extreme weather asserts its absolute dominance over the municipality, forcing all human activity to a complete and immediate halt. You listen to the freezing rain drumming aggressively against the roof, tracking a specific hollow sound that indicates a newly compromised clay tile directly above the hearth. A tiny droplet of water falls with a sharp hiss onto the banked embers, producing a brief puff of white steam and the distinct smell of wet ash. You gauge the frequency of the dripping carefully, mentally calculating whether the leak requires immediate, freezing intervention or if it can be safely ignored until daylight. The structural integrity of the insula is a fragile, constantly failing system that requires endless vigilance and exhausting improvisation. You decide firmly to leave it for now, trusting the thick layer of packed ash to absorb the minor, annoying intrusion. The relentless physical maintenance of your shelter is an exhausting, lifelong campaign against the steadily eroding forces of nature. Down near the abandoned, overgrown docks of the Emporium, the heavy rain provides perfect, necessary cover for the illicit movement of untaxed goods. A small, unlit barge slips quietly against the muddy embankment, its crew working with practiced, completely silent efficiency to secure the thick mooring ropes. Men in dark, heavy cloaks carry wooden crates of salt and sealed amphorae of wine up the slippery banks, their boots sinking deep into the freezing, sucking mud. They communicate exclusively through brief, sharp hand signals, entirely bypassing the papal toll collectors stationed at the heavily guarded main bridges. The raging storm masks the sounds of their illegal labor, swallowing the thud of the heavy cargo and the desperate grunts of the straining men. The shadow economy thrives immensely in the miserable conditions, driven by the intense, unending demand for affordable necessities in the poorer districts. You rub your eyes aggressively, clearing the sleep that refuses to fully claim you, leaving your vision blurry in the fading red light of the dying fire. The air in the room has grown noticeably heavier with the rapid onset of the rain, the dampness penetrating the stone walls and settling onto your skin like a fine, cold mist. The smell of the wetter floor mixes powerfully with the pungent odor of the damp wool, creating an atmosphere that feels uncomfortably thick enough to chew. You pull the rough blanket entirely over your head, creating a small, suffocating tent that traps your body heat and filters the terrible dampness. The strict confinement is uncomfortable but utterly necessary, a primitive survival technique deployed when the external environment becomes entirely hostile. You focus on the steady rhythm of your own breathing, a desperate attempt to endure the brutal hours that continue to evade the dawn. In the flooded, muddy expanse of the Campo Vaccino, the massive herds of Campagné cattle huddle together in a miserable, tightly packed formation. The freezing rain plasters their thick coats completely to their sides, slicking the mud and manure across their broad, shivering flanks. They stand with their heavy heads lowered, presenting their muscular backs to the driving wind, a collective, silent endurance of the atmospheric assault. The frustrated herders have retreated to the partial shelter of the ruined triumphal arches, attempting desperately to keep their small, smoky fires alive against the deluge. The ancient monuments provide a meager, drafty refuge, funneling the howling wind and amplifying the terrifying sound of the storm echoing off the classical masonry. The beasts and the men share the exact same profound discomfort, bound completely together by the brutal, unrelenting requirements of the city's fragile food supply. You listen as the driving rhythm of the rain softens into a sporadic, exhausted drizzle against the clay tiles. The storm has spent the worst of its fury, leaving behind a heavy, waterlogged silence that feels worse than the previous noise. Cold drafts carry the sharp scent of ozone and wet brick through the unsealed gaps around the heavy wooden shutter. You draw your legs up tighter, compressing your body heat into the smallest possible core against the pervasive dampness. The earthen floor radiates a seeping chill that effortlessly bypasses the meager barrier of your straw mattress. This late stage of the night tests the psychological limits of the population as firmly as their physical endurance. Timbers within the insula groan and settle as the structure absorbs the immense weight of the sudden deluge. A slow, steady drip of water falls from the damaged roof tile, splashing directly into the cooling ash of the hearth with a soft, rhythmic hiss. You stare into the pitch blackness, your eyes wide open but registering nothing beyond the erratic floaters swimming across your own vision. The rest of the household breathes in the slow, synchronized cadence of exhausted slumber, blissfully unaware of the leaking roof and the dropping temperature. You remain isolated in your wakefulness, a solitary witness to the slow, agonizing crawl of the hours toward the unseen dawn. The darkness holds you in a state of suspended animation, demanding patience in exchange for eventual light. You hear the faint, sickening sound of scavenging returning to the flooded alleyway beneath your window. A pack of feral dogs sloshes through the deep mud, their snouts low to the ground as they seek out whatever edible refuse the storm managed to unearth. Their low, territorial growls echo off the wet masonry, a stark reminder of the wildness that constantly presses against the boundaries of the domestic sphere. The beasts fight over a discarded scrap of butcher's offal, their snapping jaws and wet fur creating a visceral soundscape of desperate survival. You feel a brief flare of pity for the creatures, knowing their existence mirrors the precarious daily struggle of the city's poorest inhabitants. The line between man and animal blurs considerably when both are forced to scavenge in the freezing mud of a ruined empire. Footsteps squelch heavily through the saturated thoroughfare at the end of the block, marking the slow progress of the final night watch patrol. The communal guards are thoroughly miserable, their leather armor soaked through and their wooden clubs heavy with absorbed water. They do not bother to converse, conserving their rapidly depleting energy for the sheer physical effort of walking through the ankle-deep muck. The faint, sputtering glow of their remaining torch barely registers against the saturated brick facades, casting weak, wavering reflections in the newly formed puddles. Their presence provides zero actual security at this miserable hour, serving only as a symbolic gesture of municipal authority in a city ruled by the elements. The men are merely surviving their shift, dreaming of a warm hearth and a dry tunic. You picture the swollen Tiber surging fiercely against the ancient stone piers of the Ponte Aurelius, its volume dangerously expanded by the sudden runoff from the surrounding hills. The muddy current tears at the banks, dislodging entire trees and sweeping them downstream toward the Mediterranean. The floating mills must be straining against their thick hemp mooring ropes, their massive wooden wheels spinning wildly in the chaotic flow. You know the millers are currently engaged in a desperate freezing battle to secure their grinding mechanisms before the river rips the barges apart. The water represents an untamable force of nature that the medieval settlement merely tolerates rather than controls. The raw power of the floodwaters commands respect from anyone who has witnessed its destructive capacity. Beyond the immediate cluster of inhabited dwellings, the flooded ruins of the imperial forums stand like an archipelago of dead stone in a shallow, murky lake. The marble columns of the ancient temples reflect the starlight on their wet surfaces, rising cleanly from the polluted, stagnant water pooling around their bases. The cattle that were previously huddled among the arches have been driven to the slightly higher ground of the Palatine slopes, leaving the basin deserted to the elements. These majestic, decaying structures endure the weather with the same stoic indifference they have displayed for a millennium. The storm simply washes away another microscopic layer of history, dissolving the classical world grain by grain into the Roman mud. The present generation lives atop this ongoing dissolution, blind to the geological scale of the decay. You press the heel of your hand hard against your left temple, attempting to massage away the dull, persistent throb of the malarial headache. The dampness always aggravates the parasitic illness resting dormant in your blood, bringing forth minor echoes of the terrible fevers that plague the summer months. You swallow painfully, your throat raw and dry, despite the overwhelming humidity trapped within the small chamber. Relief will only come with the eventual warmth of the morning sun, a prospect that feels impossibly distant in the current, freezing reality. You force your breathing to slow, adopting the shallow, measured rhythm of your sleeping apprentices to trick your own body into relaxation. Endurance is a practiced skill, requiring active mental suppression of the physical miseries that compound with every passing hour. High atop the Capitoline Hill, the massive bell of the senatorial palace remains stilled, its bronze tongue quiet until the formal declaration of the new day. The overlapping jurisdictions of the popes, the nobles, and the secular senate are rendered moot by the unifying force of the deep night. The political maneuvering that consumes the daylight hours halts when the city is plunged into darkness and cold. Men who might kill each other in the markets at noon are currently engaged in the exact same shivering, desperate attempt to preserve their body heat. The darkness acts as a strict equalizer, stripping away the colorful woolen mantles of the wealthy and reducing everyone to fragile, vulnerable flesh. The grand ambitions of the municipality are temporarily suspended by the sheer biological necessity of rest. You turn your mind intentionally toward the intricate details of your leatherworking craft, using the mental exercise to distract yourself from the freezing temperature. You visualize the exact angle required to drive the iron awl smoothly through 3 layers of thick, tanned ox hide without compromising the structural integrity of the seam. The mental rehearsal of the repetitive physical labor provides a strange comfort, anchoring your thoughts in the practical reality of your daily survival. You picture the small wooden pot of melted beeswax used to seal the heavy linen threads, imagining the sweet, rich smell of the hot wax filling the workshop. The mastery of a tangible trade represents the only true security available to a common laborer in this unpredictable environment. The skills embedded in your calloused hands are far more valuable than any silver coins hidden beneath the floorboards. Before the dawn breaks, the silent infrastructure of the women will rise to begin the arduous process of restarting the household. The wife will eventually abandon the meager warmth of the blanket to kneel in the freezing ash, coaxing a new fire from the damp tinder with desperate, practiced breaths. She will haul the heavy clay jugs down to the neighborhood well, navigating the slippery, mud-choked streets to secure the daily water supply before the crowds arrive. This grueling, uncelebrated domestic labor forms the core foundation upon which the rest of the city's economy functions. The men may shape the leather and forge the iron, but the women sustain the biological machinery of the workforce. Their exhaustion is a permanent underlying condition of the medieval experience, born with a stoic resignation that defies modern comprehension. You map the dimensions of the room based solely on the location of the drafts and the faint sounds of shifting bodies. The lack of visual stimulation forces your mind to rely on the tactile and auditory senses to construct your immediate reality. You spread your fingers flat against the rough woolen blanket, feeling the coarse fibers dig into the sensitive skin of your palms. This sensory deprivation induces a strange, floating sensation, as if the physical boundaries of the insula have dissolved into the void. You are merely a point of consciousness suspended in the cold space, disconnected from the chaotic, crumbling municipality that surrounds you. The night strips away the complex layers of civic identity, leaving only the raw, fundamental awareness of your own existence. Across the river, the narrow lanes leading towards St. Peter's Basilica remain hushed, the usual throng of desperate pilgrims forced into temporary shelter. The massive, sprawling complex of the Constantinian Church sits quietly in the darkness, its vast timber roof sheltering thousands of revered relics and silent altars. The great bronze pine cone in the atrium courtyard gathers the residual rainwater, its classical metallic scales washed clean by the passing storm. A few dedicated clerics maintain the perpetual vigil near the Confessio, their small oil lamps providing the only illumination in the cavernous, echoing nave. The spiritual heart of Western Christendom beats at a slow, resting rhythm, waiting for the dawn to bring the daily flood of penitent travelers back to its heavy wooden doors. The sacred and the mundane share the same quiet suspension. You clench your jaw tightly, fighting down a sudden, involuntary shiver that threatens to rack your entire frame. The struggle against the cold is an active, ongoing engagement, requiring constant minor adjustments to your posture and breathing. You curl your toes inside the thin linen foot wraps, trying to generate a tiny fraction of friction to ward off the encroaching numbness. The sheer obstinacy required to survive a Roman winter is bred into the bone, passed down through generations of peasants who refuse to abandon the ruins. You draw upon that inherited stubbornness now, refusing to yield to the misery of the freezing, damp mattress. The night is a crucible designed to burn away the weak, and you have no intention of failing the test. The biting wind begins to lose its sharpest edge, shifting from a howling assault into a low, steady moan pushing down the Tiber Valley. The extreme violence of the weather pattern has broken, leaving behind a cold, saturated stillness that feels dense and oppressive. Even the feral dogs have abandoned their scavenging, retreating into the dry cellars and ruined crypts to sleep off the miserable conditions. The silence that follows the storm is not peaceful. It is the exhausted, battered quiet of a landscape that has simply endured too much. The city feels bruised and waterlogged, its fragile infrastructure pushed to the breaking point by the millions of gallons of water dumped upon its uneven roofs. The cleanup required in the coming daylight will be monumental, demanding immense effort from a population already stretched thin. You track the slow, agonizing drip of the water falling from the ceiling, counting the seconds between each impact to occupy your restless mind. The rhythm is erratic, preventing you from falling into any sort of meditative trance. You trace the imaginary lines of the constellations you know are hidden behind the thick layer of storm clouds, seeking order in a chaotic, unpredictable universe. The knowledge that the stars remain fixed above the tempest provides a minor, philosophical comfort against the immediate, physical wretchedness. You endure the slow crawl of time with a grim, practiced fatalism, accepting the suffering as the unavoidable price of your existence. The dawn will eventually come, because it always does, but the wait feels like an eternity carved from freezing stone. In the coldest hour just before the faintest hint of morning, the atmosphere reaches its true nadir of misery. The temperature drops its final few degrees, turning the puddles in the alleyway into slick, treacherous sheets of black ice. The humidity trapped inside the dwelling condenses heavily on the cold stone walls, forming beads of icy moisture that run down the plaster like slow tears. This is the moment when the resolve of the sick breaks, when the frailest members of the community quietly slip away into the dark. The crushing weight of the darkness feels like a physical pressure pressing against your chest, making every single breath an active, labored effort. The eternal city holds its breath, balancing precariously on the sharp knife edge between survival and surrender. You hold your breath for a long moment, listening to the vast emptiness that follows the cessation of the rain. The silence in the chamber possesses a heavy, almost liquid quality that presses inward against your eardrums. A single drop of condensation falls from a roof timber, striking the packed earth near the hearth with a sharp, resonant snap. The freezing air bites at the exposed skin of your face, carrying the metallic scent of wet soot and damp straw. You pull the rough woolen blanket higher, tucking the frayed edge firmly beneath your chin to seal the meager pocket of trapped warmth. The physical boundaries of your world have shrunk down to the dimensions of this stiff, abrasive fabric. This isolated span of hours demands a specific kind of mental endurance, a quiet refusal to yield to the penetrating cold. Outside the barred wooden shutter, the city exists in a state of suspended animation. No carts rumble over the uneven paving stones, and the usual chorus of feral dogs has fallen silent in the aftermath of the storm. The Tiber River continues its relentless push against the ancient bridge piers, a low, rumbling vibration that you feel more than you hear. Water drains slowly from the flooded alleyways, trickling through the narrow brick channels in a steady, monotonous rhythm. The thick stone walls of the insula muffle these exterior sounds, wrapping the interior space in a cocoon of suffocating stillness. The architecture itself seems to slumber, the ancient materials contracting minutely in the freezing temperature. You feel a dull, persistent ache throbbing at the base of your neck, the result of lying rigid on the unyielding mattress. The crude stuffing offers little defense against the cold radiating upward from the damp floor, forcing your muscles to maintain a constant, exhausting tension. You shift your hips a fraction of an inch, seeking a slightly softer depression in the pack straw. The movement produces a loud, dry rustle that seems to echo loudly in the hushed room, threatening to wake the sleeping apprentice nearby. You freeze instantly, waiting for any change in the boy's slow, rhythmic breathing before allowing yourself to relax again. The close quarters demand strict physical discipline, a continuous awareness of how your own body impacts the fragile rest of the household. By this late stage of the vigil, the concept of measured time has dissolved into a formless, freezing void. The church bells remain silent, withholding their bronze markers and leaving the population adrift in the featureless dark. The interval between the midnight office and the eventual morning prayers stretches into a formidable expanse of unbroken obscurity. Shadows cling thickly to the corners of the chamber, refusing to yield even the slightest detail to your straining eyes. The dying embers in the hearth have finally gone black, extinguishing the last remaining source of visual reference in the room. The darkness is a physical weight, pressing down upon the chest and restricting the intake of the icy air. You trace the rough seam of your tunic where it rubs against your collarbone, focusing on the tactile sensation to anchor your wandering thoughts. The heavy, undyed wool retains the pungent odors of the tanning workshop, a permanent oily smell of rendered fat and harsh chemicals. These lingering scents serve as a stark reminder of the grueling labor awaiting you as soon as the sun breaks over the eastern hills. You flex your fingers slowly, working the stiff joints to ensure they will be ready to grip the iron awl and the curved cutting knife. The survival of your dependents rests squarely on the continued dexterity of your calloused hands. There is no safety net in this ruined capital, only the brutal daily exchange of physical effort for coarse bread. The heavy oak door guarding the entrance to your dwelling stands as a vital, primitive barrier against the chaotic municipality. Its thick timber planks are scarred from years of hard use, bound together by rusted iron bands and secured by a massive crude crossbar. This single piece of wood separates the vulnerable sleeping family from the unpredictable threats that roam the unlit alleys. Wind attempts to pry its way through the uneven gaps around the frame, whistling in a high, thin pitch that sets the teeth on edge. The door groans slightly under the atmospheric pressure, a wooden sentinel holding the line against the encroaching dampness. The illusion of safety it provides is necessary for whatever meager rest the inhabitants manage to scrape together. You cast your mind backward to the bustling midday market, using the vibrant memory to push back against the current desolation. You recall the sharp, theatrical voice of the fishmonger arguing over the price of a salted catch, his hands waving in expansive, exaggerated gestures. The memory of the sun warming the travertine paving stones feels like an impossible dream in the freezing reality of the pre-dawn hours. You remember the dense, heavy smell of roasting onions wafting from a nearby cookshop, a scent that made your stomach clench with sudden hunger. These bright, noisy fragments of the daylight world feel disconnected from the present moment, belonging to a different lifetime. The contrast between the chaotic, crowded municipality and this solitary, freezing vigil is stark and final. Frost continues to accumulate on the exterior surfaces of the city, a creeping, silent crystallization that glazes the world in ice. The temperature has plummeted to its lowest point, freezing the shallow puddles left behind by the recent storm. The dampness within the insula has transformed into a biting, localized chill that numbs the extremities and slows the circulation of the blood. The physical structure of the building offers shelter from the wind, but it traps the cold like a stone vault. The air entering your lungs feels sharp and abrasive, stinging the sensitive tissues of your throat with every inhalation. Surviving this specific hour requires drawing upon reserves of stamina built up over a lifetime of seasonal hardship. You press your lips tightly together, fighting the urge to cough and clear the pooling phlegm from your chest. The respiratory ailments native to the Tiber Valley thrive in these stagnant, freezing conditions, settling into the lungs of the unwary. You swallow hard, forcing the irritation down and maintaining the strict, unbroken silence of the sleeping chamber. The wife shifts on her pallet across the room, murmuring a fragmented, unintelligible syllable before sinking back into a heavy torpor. You listen to her breathing stabilize, taking a small measure of comfort in the presence of another living soul sharing the bitter cold. The shared ordeal weaves an unspoken solidarity among the residents of the cramped, decaying building. Beyond the immediate neighborhood, the sprawling ruins of the classical empire sit frozen under the starless sky. The massive, shattered dome of the Pantheon looms over its irregular piazza, the great open oculus exposing the interior to the freezing elements. The ancient columns of the surrounding porticos are slick with frozen rain, their intricate Corinthian capitals wrapped in shadows. The medieval inhabitants avoid these grand, decaying structures during the dark hours, fearing the lingering spirits of the forgotten pagan builders. The architecture of the ancients serves as a haunting backdrop to the fragile, squabbling civilization that currently occupies the site. The stones endure the centuries with a terrifying and indifferent patience, outlasting emperors and popes alike. You run a hand over your face, feeling the rough stubble along your jawline and the permanent creases around your eyes. The physical toll of your existence is mapped clearly upon your features, a record of scarce food, brutal labor, and constant low-level anxiety. You press your fingertips against your closed eyelids, producing flashes of abstract, meaningless color in the pitch blackness. The mind seeks any form of stimulation to combat the sensory deprivation of the long, featureless vigil. You force your eyes open again, staring into the dark until the vague looming shapes of the stacked firewood begin to resolve. The visual isolation forces an uncomfortable confrontation with your own solitary thoughts. A faint, barely perceptible change in the air pressure signals a minor shift in the prevailing weather patterns. The stagnant, heavy atmosphere within the room stirs slightly, carrying the stale odor of unwashed wool and cold hearth ash. The smell is thick and earthy, an olfactory signature of poverty and enclosed, communal living. The lack of ventilation traps every human scent, creating a dense microclimate that the inhabitants simply learn to ignore. The air tastes of dust and old breath, a flavor that coats the tongue and lines the back of the throat. The environment is a closed system, recycling the same stale elements until the heavy door is finally thrown open to the morning. You think about the complicated, overlapping debts that bind your household to the local merchants and the parish priests. The cost of raw leather, the tithes demanded by the church, and the unpredictable price of coarse grain form a tightening web of obligation. You calculate the necessary output of the coming week, measuring the limits of your physical endurance against the relentless demands of the creditors. The economic anxiety is a cold, hard knot resting permanently in the pit of your stomach, immune to the comforts of rest or faith. The medieval economy is a brutal, zero-sum game played without the benefit of mercy or a safety net. Your continued survival depends on navigating these treacherous financial currents with strict, unwavering focus. You picture the towering fortress of the Castel Sant'Angelo remaining a dark, imposing silhouette against the western horizon, guarding the approach to the Vatican Hill. The papal guards walk their high, exposed battlements, their heavy cloaks stiff with the freezing mist rising from the river below. The wealth and power concentrated within those thick, cylindrical walls stands in mocking contrast to the crumbling insulae of the artisan districts. The spiritual authority of the Curia is backed by solid masonry, fortified gates, and the sharp steel of loyal retainers. The populace accepts this vast disparity as the natural, ordained order of the universe, a hierarchy established by God and enforced by the nobility. The fortress is a constant physical reminder of where the true power resides in the eternal city. You clench your jaw, suppressing a sudden, harsh shiver that threatens to rack your exhausted frame. The chill has bypassed the outer layers of the blanket, sinking into the core of your body and stiffening the larger muscle groups. You draw your knees up even tighter, adopting a fetal position that maximizes the retention of your dwindling body heat. The physical mechanics of survival in the pre-dawn hours are primitive and undignified, stripping away any pretense of comfort. You focus all your remaining mental energy on a single vital objective, outlasting the dark. The sheer stubborn will to live is the only resource that does not cost silver or require the blessing of a priest. You note the dripping from the damaged roof tile has finally ceased, the water likely frozen solid in the cracks of the clay. The silence in the chamber is now unbroken, a terrifying absence of sound that leaves a ringing sensation in the ears. The stillness is so profound that the irregular scratching movement of a single insect against the plaster wall becomes a major auditory event. The microscopic world asserts its presence in the void, reminding you that the dwelling is shared by thousands of unseen, creeping inhabitants. The boundary between the human domain and the natural world is porous and constantly contested. The dark amplifies these minor intrusions, turning the mundane reality of the crumbling building into a source of quiet dread. You listen intently for the first faint stirring of the bakers in the neighboring alley, desperate for any sign of human activity. The industrial ovens must be fired long before the sun rises, their roaring heat providing the initial spark that restarts the municipal machinery. You strain your ears, hoping to catch the muffled thud of a heavy wooden dough trough or the scrape of an iron peel against brick. The anticipation builds a tight, uncomfortable pressure in your chest, a yearning for the chaotic noise of the daylight hours. The isolation of the vigil has become a tangible burden, a psychological weight that matches the physical oppression of the cold. You wait with a tense, breathless vigilance, praying for the earliest possible interruption of the silence. The scent of wet decay rising from the nearby forms permeates the chilled air, carrying the smell of rotting vegetation and damp earth. The odor is a testament to the geological layers of history decaying quietly beneath the foundations of the medieval settlement. The city is built upon a compost heap of ruined empires, drawing its sustenance from the broken monuments and shattered marble of its ancestors. The physical reality of Rome is a constant, inescapable dialogue with mortality and the inevitable collapse of human ambition. The residents breathe in the dust of the Caesars with every inhalation, their lives intertwined with the slow, geological crumbling of the past. The atmosphere is heavy with the weight of uncounted, forgotten generations. You map the precise location of your tools in the pitch blackness, visualizing the workbench with practiced, intimate familiarity. The curved cutting knife rests near the edge of the scarred wood, its blade honed to a razor edge the previous evening. The heavy wooden mallet sits beside the pile of unfinished leather scraps, waiting to drive the iron awl through the thick hides. This mental inventory provides a necessary anchor, connecting your isolated consciousness to the practical requirements of the coming day. You review the specific steps required to finish the merchant's harness, planning the sequence of cuts and stitches to maximize your efficiency. The discipline of the craft offers a structured refuge from the formless, wandering anxieties of the freezing night. The rough texture of the straw mattress pressing against your ribs becomes a singular point of intense focus. The dry stalks possess a sharp, unyielding quality, poking through the thin linen of your tunic and irritating the skin. You catalog every point of discomfort along your spine, acknowledging the physical toll without allowing it to break your stoic resolve. The body is merely a vessel required to perform labor, its minor agonies secondary to the overarching goal of continued survival. The medieval mind compartmentalizes physical suffering, treating it as an inevitable, unremarkable condition of mortal existence. The discomfort is simply another element of the environment, no different from the freezing temperature or the suffocating darkness. You tighten your grip on the frayed edge of the blanket, your knuckles turning white from the sustained exertion. The cold possesses a malicious searching quality, probing for any gap in the woolen defense to sap your remaining warmth. You adjust the fabric over your shoulder, sealing a tiny draft that was leaking icy air across your collarbone. The defense against the elements is a continuous, active engagement, demanding constant vigilance even in the deepest stages of exhaustion. You refuse to surrender any ground to the biting chill, matching the hostility of the environment with a grim, silent defiance. The vigil is a test of endurance, and you intend to see it through to the freezing end. The darkest phase of the night holds the city in a tight, uncompromising grip, a frozen suspension before the eventual turning of the earth. The inhabitants of the insulae, the monks in their choirs, and the guards on the ancient walls are united in their shared, miserable endurance. The eternal city waits in the freezing void, its crumbling ruins and fortified towers stark and blind under the heavy cloud cover. The struggle for existence is reduced to its most basic elemental form, a battle to maintain body heat and sanity against the crushing weight of the dark. The dawn remains a distant, abstract promise, offering no immediate comfort to the shivering population trapped in the bitter, pre-dawn stillness. You feel the subtle shift in the room's temperature as the trough of the night settles over the floorboards. The dampness from the recent storm seems to have crystallized in the air, transforming the breathing of your apprentices into sharp plumes of pale vapor in the gloom. The thick brick walls of the insula act as a stone sponge, absorbing the ambient cold and radiating it back into the confined living space with a malicious intensity. You press your palms flat against the coarse weave of the woolen blanket, using the minor friction to generate a fleeting illusion of warmth against your freezing skin. The sheer physical effort required to simply exist in this extreme climate demands an exhausting toll on your skeletal frame. Endurance is the only currency that matters in these final, brutal hours before the turning of the earth brings any actual relief. Across the cramped chamber, A wooden stool creaks as the shifting temperature forces the timber joints to contract and complain. The sound is sharp and sudden in the oppressive hush, cutting through the muffled darkness like a snapped twig in a silent forest. You map the exact layout of the room using only these microscopic acoustic shifts, visualizing the scarred table, the dead hearth, and the stacked leather hides waiting for your all. The tools of your trade rest exactly where you abandoned them at Vespers, cold iron and smooth wood, waiting patiently for the return of your calloused hands. The predictability of the workshop provides a necessary mental anchor when the rest of the municipality feels swallowed by the lack of sunlight. You rely on this structured, physical reality to push back against the formless, wandering anxieties that breed in the pre-dawn obscurity. You imagine the labyrinth of the catacombs snaking far beneath the muddy fields of the Campagna, shielded from the biting wind and the freezing rain. The ancient, subterranean corridors hold a constant, dry temperature, sheltering the stacked bones of the early martyrs in undisturbed peace. The medieval mind frequently dwells on this vast, hidden necropolis, drawing a strange comfort from the sheer scale of the silent army resting below the soil. You consider the countless generations of Romans who have endured this exact same seasonal misery, their struggles eventually swallowed by the deep volcanic tufa. The historical weight of the eternal city is not merely a philosophical concept. It is a physical pressure that you feel bearing down upon your own exhausted shoulders. The past is a permanent, looming presence that makes the individual lifespan feel fragile and fleeting. A sudden, sharp draft slices across your exposed neck, carrying the distinct, metallic odor of the flooded Tiber River. The muddy waters must be cresting against the marble piers of the Ponts Illes, dragging massive uprooted trees and ruined debris toward the distant sea. You know the floating mills are currently fighting a desperate, losing battle against the churning current, their thick hemp mooring ropes screaming under the incredible hydraulic stress. The river is a mindless, devouring entity during these winter squalls, indifferent to the vital grain processing it normally provides the dependent population. The roar of the floodwaters serves as a heavy bass note for the entire valley, a constant vibration that travels through the bedrock and into the foundation of your crumbling building. The city survives at the unpredictable mercy of the watershed. You shift your focus to the intricate raised scars crisscrossing the back of your left hand, tracing the hardened tissue with your opposite thumb. Each pale line represents a specific lapse in concentration at the workbench, a moment where the curved cutting knife slipped on a stubborn piece of tanned oxhide. The physical damage is simply the accepted cost of your profession, an unavoidable toll extracted by the relentless demand for harnesses and belts. You flex the stiffened joints deliberately, working against the encroaching numbness to ensure your fingers remain pliable for the morning's impending labor. The margin for error in the medieval economy is virtually non-existent, meaning a crippled hand translates swiftly into the terrifying prospect of outright starvation. The preservation of your physical utility is the single most important task you undertake during these freezing, idle hours. Somewhere deep within the labyrinth of the merchant quarter, a heavy wooden cartwheel strikes a cobblestone with a dull, resonant thud. The isolated noise indicates that the most desperate scavengers have already begun their miserable, freezing patrols through the saturated alleyways. These unseen figures sift through the refuse left behind by the storm, seeking a discarded bone, a broken tool, or a scrap of usable linen in the freezing muck. The municipal hierarchy is brutally stark, sorting the population into those who sleep securely behind barred oak doors and those who wander the darkness out of sheer necessity. You recognize your own precarious position on that social ladder, understanding how quickly a prolonged illness could banish your household to the same desperate circumstances. The fear of destitution is a permanent cold knot resting firmly in the pit of your stomach. You turn your head slightly, catching the faint, acrid scent of wet ash rising from the dead hearth. The wife will need to haul a fresh bundle of damp kindling from the ground floor storage bin as soon as the first gray light penetrates the shutter. The daily resurrection of the domestic fire requires a frustrating, lung-burning effort, coaxing a fragile flame from the stubborn, rain-soaked timber. Her silent, relentless labor forms the invisible bedrock of the family unit, providing the crucial heat in the boiled pottage that sustains your own grueling work at the bench. The division of endurance is strictly drawn, with every member of the cramped insula bearing a specific crushing weight of the survival equation. You acknowledge her impending struggle with a grim, silent respect, knowing the household machinery cannot function without her exhaustion. High atop the fortified remains of the Palatine Hill, The wind continues to howl through the open, shattered vaults of the imperial palaces. The feral cats that colonize the majestic ruins must be huddled deep within the subterranean brick corridors, waiting out the bitter chill in the darkness. The medieval population views those colossal, crumbling structures with a deep superstitious dread, attributing their destruction to divine wrath and demonic occupation. You share that fundamental, unquestioned belief, preferring the cramped, foul-smelling safety of the artisan district to the haunted, echoing expanses of the ancient elite. The architecture of the classical world serves only to intimidate the current residents, mocking their fragile timber dwellings with its sheer, incomprehensible scale. The past is a terrifying, alien landscape that happens to occupy the exact same geographic coordinates as your present misery. You pull the rough woolen fabric over your mouth, creating a small, suffocating pocket of trapped air that warms your freezing nose. The coarse fibers smell strongly of lanolin and stale sweat, a pungent combination that you have long since stopped registering as offensive. The medieval approach to hygiene is a matter of strict pragmatism rather than preference, dictated by the immense difficulty of heating water and the profound lack of clean garments. You exist in a permanent state of mild grime, a condition shared universally by every common laborer, merchant, and minor cleric you encounter in the daily markets. The physical reality of the body is simply managed rather than pampered, an ongoing process of patching and enduring until the flesh finally fails. You accept the discomfort as the natural, ordained state of the mortal realm. A single distant dog begins to bark with a frantic, rhythmic intensity, the sound carrying cleanly through the saturated, freezing air. The sharp alarm indicates the approach of a nocturnal threat, perhaps a bold wolf venturing too close to the city walls, or a band of thieves working a vulnerable warehouse. You listen closely to the cadence of the barking, assessing the proximity of the danger with the practiced ear of a lifelong urban survivor. The noise remains safely isolated in the direction of the southern gates, prompting you to release a long, drawn-out breath of pent-up tension. The strict rule of the night demands that you ignore any crisis that does not directly assault your own heavy wooden door. The preservation of the self overrides any theoretical impulse towards civic intervention or neighborhood solidarity. You picture the massive iron-bound doors of the Pantheon standing resolute against the freezing mist drifting off the nearby piazzas. The spectacular open oculus in the dome allows the winter weather to fall directly onto the intricate, geometrically patterned marble floor of the interior. The medieval clerics who maintain the ancient structure as a functioning church must constantly battle the elements, sweeping away the rainwater and the occasional dusting of snow. The sheer, awe-inspiring volume of the space defies the cramped, claustrophobic reality of the surrounding residential blocks, offering a glimpse of an impossible, forgotten engineering mastery. You hold the image of the great dark void in your mind, contrasting its perfect spherical silence with the chaotic, irregular squalor of your own neighborhood. The city is a schizophrenic collection of these staggering architectural extremes. You feel the dull, familiar ache returning to the base of your spine, the inevitable consequence of maintaining a rigid posture on the packed earth. The straw mattress offers virtually no cushioning against the hard ground, turning every prolonged period of rest into a grueling test of skeletal endurance. You deliberately force your muscles to uncoil, relaxing your shoulders and allowing your back to sink heavily into the abrasive bedding. The temporary relief is fleeting, quickly replaced by the seeping chill that radiates upward from the damp foundation blocks. The body is a theater of minor, competing agonies, requiring constant, conscious management to prevent the pain from becoming overwhelming. You navigate the discomfort with a stoic, wordless patience, treating the physical suffering as a normal component of the nocturnal cycle. The faintest suggestion of a scent drifts through the gaps in the shutter, carrying the unmistakable aroma of roasting malt and heated yeast. The large commercial bakeries situated near the grain markets have finally sparked their massive brick ovens, beginning the industrial process that feeds the dense population. The smell is subtle, barely noticeable beneath the overwhelming odor of the wet masonry, yet it signals a profound, crucial shift in the timeline of the night. The first invisible steps toward the dawn have been taken by the laborers who sacrificed their own rest to prepare the city's daily bread. You focus intensely on the olfactory clue, using the smell of the baking grain as a psychological lifeline against the crushing weight of the dark. The realization that other hands are actively working provides a necessary, comforting crack in the absolute isolation of the chamber. You review the specific interactions planned for the upcoming market day, mentally rehearsing the delicate negotiations required to secure a favorable price for your finished goods. The cloth merchant near the theater ruins is notoriously difficult, known for finding invisible flaws in the leather to justify a substantially reduced payment. You craft your arguments in advance, preparing to defend the quality of your stitching and the uniform thickness of the tan hide with aggressive, theatrical confidence. The commercial theater of the Roman markets demands a specific, forceful persona, a sharp contrast to the introspective endurance you practice in the dark. The mental preparation acts as a useful shield, arming you for the inevitable, noisy conflicts that await in the crowded piazzas. Your livelihood depends entirely on winning these small daily battles of commercial willpower. You listen as the stillness of the room is suddenly broken by the loud, wet cough of the oldest member of the household, a jagged sound that tears through the freezing air. The grandmother struggles for a long moment to clear her congested lungs, her fragile chest heaving visibly in the dim gloom of the buried embers. You listen with a tight, helpless anxiety, knowing that the winter dampness routinely claims the elderly before the spring thaw can bring any relief. Her breathing eventually settles back into a shallow, ragged rhythm, a testament to the stubborn resilience of a woman who has survived 7 decades in this brutal environment. The proximity of death is a constant, acknowledged reality in the insula, accepted with a grim fatalism that precludes any outward display of panic. You offer a brief, silent prayer for her continued endurance, asking the saints for just a few more months of breath. You pull your hands deep inside the sleeves of your tunic, crossing your arms tightly over your chest to maximize the retention of your core heat. The physical mechanics of shivering take over, generating a rapid, involuntary muscle tremor that burns through your meager caloric reserves with alarming speed. You understand the biological cost of this defense mechanism, knowing it will leave you hollow and ravenous when the sun finally breaks. The peasant diet provides precious little surplus energy, making every cold night a literal drain on the body's stored vitality. The winter season is a slow, agonizing process of gradual starvation and physical depletion, a race to survive until the agricultural cycle can resume. You clench your teeth together to stop them from chattering loudly, maintaining the strict discipline of the shared sleeping space. You think about the massive bronze doors of the Lateran Basilica, standing resolute against the freezing wind sweeping across the eastern edge of the city. The cathedral serves as the true seat of the papal authority, a sprawling complex of administrative buildings and sacred spaces that rivals a small city in its own right. The political maneuverings of the Curia echo through those vast halls, deciding the fate of distant kingdoms and launching crusades across the Mediterranean. The contrast between that unimaginable global power and your own freezing, cramped existence feels vast and unbridgeable. You occupy the lowest rung of a divine hierarchy that stretches from the packed earth of your floor to the glittering, mosaic-covered domes of heaven. The sheer weight of that cosmic order presses down upon you, demanding absolute obedience and silent, uncomplaining labor. The air pressure shifts once again, a subtle dropping of the atmospheric weight that often precedes the first invisible lightening of the eastern horizon. The change is imperceptible to the eye, registered solely by the sensitive skin of your face and the settling dust of the chamber. The darkest, most oppressive stage of the pre-dawn stillness is finally beginning to crack, yielding to the slow, inevitable mechanics of the solar cycle. You maintain your rigid, huddled posture, refusing to relax your guard until the gray light actually penetrates the gaps in the wooden shutter. The final hour of the vigil is always the most treacherous, tempting the mind with the false promise of immediate relief. You force yourself to endure the remaining blackness with the exact same grim, focused intensity that has carried you through the entire freezing night. You notice a fractional softening in the impenetrable density of the blackness. It is not yet light, merely a subtle thinning of the pitch that has choked the room for hours. The heavy oak door seems to lose its sharp, menacing outline, merging back into the general gloom of the entryway. A solitary drop of condensation gathered on the iron latch finally breaks free. It strikes the packed earth with a flat, muted tap. The sound does not echo, absorbed instantly by the dense, freezing humidity trapped within the plaster walls. You shift your jaw slightly, releasing the tight clench that has locked your teeth together since the passing of the midnight storm. The muscles in your neck complain with a dull, localized ache, a physical receipt for maintaining such rigid vigilance. The vigil is slowly reaching its natural conclusion, releasing you from the strict demands of the nocturnal watch. Massive supporting timbers of the insula groan under the shifting atmospheric pressure. This slow, deep vibration travels through the floorboards before you actually hear the sound. The wood expands a fraction of an inch as the bitter chill of the deep night begins to plateau, settling into a stable, numbing constant. A flake of ancient mortar detaches from the ceiling directly above the dead hearth, falling with a dry, papery whisper into the cold ash. You track these minute structural complaints with the practiced ear of a long-term resident, translating the groans and whispers into a structural diagnosis of your shelter. The building is a battered ancient vessel navigating the treacherous currents of the Roman winter, taking on water but stubbornly refusing to sink. You trace the rough grain of a wooden beam near your head, finding strange comfort in the enduring solidity of the seasoned oak. The material has survived centuries of rot and fire, offering a silent promise of continued protection. You focus your attention on the slow, synchronized breathing of your extended household. Allowing the steady rhythm to dictate the pacing of your own lungs, you find a small measure of calm. The apprentice exhales with a soft, whistling flutter, his small chest rising and falling in the absolute surrender of deep slumber. The wife shifts her weight on the adjacent pallet, the dry straw protesting with a harsh rustle before she settles back into an unmoving, silent mass. You draw a slow, shallow breath through your nose, filtering the sharp, freezing air to minimize the shock to your irritated throat. The shared exhalations of the sleeping bodies create a microscopic, fragile dome of warmth hovering just inches above the floor. This communal heat is a precious, invisible commodity generated through shared suffering and hoarded fiercely against the drafts. The room functions as a single, multi-lunged organism fighting desperately to maintain its internal temperature. You press the side of your face firmly against the coarse, unyielding fabric of the woolen blanket. The individual fibers bite into the sensitive skin of your cheek. The material is heavy with absorbed moisture, yet it still manages to deflect the biting edges of the ambient chill. You slide your calloused palm down the length of your thigh, mapping the rigid tension in your muscles and the rough seams of your linen under tunic. The physical sensation of your own body provides a necessary tether to the physical realm, countering the floating, disembodied feeling induced by the prolonged sensory deprivation. You curl your toes deliberately inside the stiff leather of your turn shoes, working the joints until the faint, painful tingling indicates the sluggish return of blood flow. The slow restoration of feeling is an agonizing process, a physical thawing that burns far worse than the initial freezing. Your physical form demands relentless, painful management to ensure its continued utility. Beyond the thick barrier of the shutter, the muddy torrent of the Tiber River produces a low, continuous rumble. This vibration beats against the deep foundations of the district. The floodwaters are likely cresting now, pushing massive waterlogged tree trunks and the shattered remains of careless docks against the ancient stone bridge piers. You picture the churning, chaotic surface of the water, thick with silt and debris ripped from the distant Apennine slopes. The river's fury is a blind, indifferent force, a chaotic counterpoint to the rigid geometric discipline of the classical ruins it currently threatens to submerge. The sound of the rushing water acts as a form of white noise, sweeping away the minor, irritating scratches of the vermin and the settling of the masonry. You allow the overwhelming aquatic roar to fill the empty spaces of your mind, washing away the complex overlapping anxieties of the coming market negotiations. The sheer scale of the natural violence renders your individual economic struggles temporarily insignificant. High on the Aventine Hill, a single pure note from a bronze bell cuts cleanly through the rumbling background noise of the flood. The tolling marks the transition from matins to lauds, signaling the final sequence of prayers before the anticipated arrival of the dawn. The monks are finishing their grueling, freezing vigil in the unlit choir, their voices likely cracked and hoarse from hours of continuous chanting. You imagine the thick beeswax candles burning down to irregular stubs, casting frantic, leaping shadows across the golden mosaic saints looming in the apse. Their spiritual labor runs parallel to your physical endurance, two distinct methods of surviving the exact same oppressive dark. The bell rings twice more, the sound decaying slowly in the heavy, saturated air until it is swallowed wholly by the roar of the river. The ecclesiastical marker confirms that the longest, most punishing phase of the night has finally been successfully navigated. You draw another measured breath, identifying the new, distinct layer within the complex olfactory landscape of the cramped chamber. The sharp, acrid smell of burning oak has joined the faint, sweet scent of roasting malt, drifting over from the commercial bakeries operating in the adjacent alleys. The massive brick ovens have reached their optimal baking temperature, radiating a fierce, localized heat that must be a staggering relief to the flour-dusted laborers. The scent of the baking bread triggers a sharp, involuntary clench in your empty stomach, a biological demand for the calories required to fuel the impending workday. You swallow the excess saliva pooling in your mouth, forcing the hunger back down into the cold knot resting beneath your ribs. The physical craving is simply another element to be managed, a constant nagging companion that will not be satisfied until the morning pottage is fully boiled. The smell of the distant ovens serves as a tangible, aromatic promise that the city is beginning its slow, agonizing resurrection. Gradually, the quality of the cold alters, shifting from a searching assault into a heavy, stagnant pool of frigid air resting directly upon your chest. The temperature is no longer dropping, having reached its absolute nadir, establishing a baseline of misery that your body must simply accept as the new reality. You relax your shoulders a fraction of an inch, abandoning the rigid, defensive posture that has exhausted your muscles for the past several hours. The surrender to the cold is a necessary tactical retreat, trading the futile resistance for a measure of desperately needed physical relaxation. You feel the chill seep deeper into your joints, an aching numbness that ironically provides a strange, disconnected form of relief from the previous sharp pains. The boundaries between your own flesh and the freezing environment begin to blur, a numb integration into the harsh conditions of the room. Your body adopts the temperature of the stone, matching the stubborn, freezing endurance of the architecture itself. By this late hour, the mental ledger of debts, obligations, and necessary tasks finally ceases its frantic, cyclical spinning within the confines of your exhausted mind. You lack the surplus energy required to worry about the cost of beeswax, the availability of raw hides, or the treacherous mood of the merchant near the theater ruins. The sheer weight of the physical ordeal has crushed the complex anxieties of the daylight hours, leaving only a vast, empty plain of raw exhaustion. You trace the imaginary line of the heavy iron awl in your thoughts, but the image lacks its usual urgent clarity, fading rapidly into a dull, formless blur. The demanding, intricate details of your leatherworking craft slip away from your conscious control, replaced by a profound, overwhelming desire for absolute stillness. The mind surrenders its frantic grip on the future, collapsing back into the immediate, pressing reality of the dark room. You are no longer planning or calculating, merely existing in the quiet void. You rest the back of your head firmly into the packed straw, noting the specific sharp prick of a single broken stalk against your scalp. The mattress has lost whatever meager loft it possessed at the beginning of the night, compressed flat into a hard, unforgiving mat by the sustained weight of your body. You slowly uncurl your legs, extending your cramped calves and allowing your feet to hang over the edge of the woven pallet, seeking contact with the freezing, packed earth. The shock of the cold ground against your bare heels is grounding, a final sharp anchor connecting you to the physical geometry of the dwelling. You feel the heavy, woolen tunic bunch uncomfortably around your waist, but the massive effort required to adjust the garment outweighs the minor, localized irritation. You accept the awkward position, allowing the overwhelming fatigue to sink heavily into your bones like water absorbing into dry sand. The physical reality of the room is fading, eclipsed by the sheer, crushing gravity of your own exhaustion. You register the exact way the freezing air sits perfectly still against the exposed skin of your forehead, forming a heavy, unmoving mask of absolute cold. The distant, continuous rumble of the swollen Tiber River smooths out into a flat, formless drone that no longer registers as a threat, becoming a lulling, environmental hum. You feel the specific rough texture of the frayed woolen hem where it brushes against your chin, a scratchy, familiar sensation that signals the end of the required vigilance. The sharp, acrid scent of the ancient wet mortar in the wall seems to dilute, replaced wholly by the immediate, overwhelming smell of the dry straw directly beneath your nose. The faint, high-pitched whistling of the wind searching for gaps around the heavy oak door loses its menacing edge, transforming into a meaningless, distant sigh. You release the final, stubborn knot of tension holding your jaw clamped shut, allowing your mouth to relax into the dark. The slow, rhythmic scrape of a settling timber echoes faintly overhead as the absolute stillness of the room finally claims you. You close your eyes. Rest well, for these crumbling streets will wait patiently for your return.